Hello and welcome back to another stream of Skievers Plays. It has been a long time. It has been a very long time, and as Sharky explained last night, I was getting a bit over Crash. It's just too hard, and it's just too cold. That's the main thing. So it's too cold in Australia right now that my fingers just freeze up and I cannot play with the controller at this time of night. So we're starting a new thing. We are starting something new. It is called Idle Book Club, Skievers Idle Book Club. So I hope you all enjoy. But basically what is going to happen is that I'm going to play Cookie Clicker, and while that's going, I'm also going to read a book series. So we'll see how long this lasts for. I'm going to start with the Prison Healer trilogy. The first book is called The Prison Healer, and I really enjoyed it. This is my favourite series so far. The trilogy is fully out now. The third one came out in May. I'm halfway through the second one because I've been trying to do other craft for a friend's birthday that's coming up. And also I am due to have my second baby in October, so I haven't had a lot of time to read. So I've completely finished the first one when it came out last year. The second one came out in September last year. And I didn't want to read it too far away from the third one being released, so I put it off, and then I got pregnant. So I'm halfway through that because I've been trying to work on other crafts that I'm doing for a friend's birthday, which is due at the end of next month of July. So I will start by reading the blurb, and then I'll get into some Cookie Clicker. And then once I've got some Cookie Clicker set up, then I will read the first chapter, come back to Cookie Clicker, do some more of that, and so on and so forth. So I will break it up by reading a chapter, playing some Cookie Clicker, then going back and reading another chapter. So we'll see how far we get. If we finish this in good time, then I shall start another one. So thanks Novak in the chat there. Much excite, very book, yep. So the blurb for this book, I'll read the blurb, and I'll also read the inside, which is also a part of the blurb. So the message was clear: don't let her die. We are coming. Kiva's breath caught as those final three words repeated in her mind. We are coming. We are coming. We are coming. No longer a vague promise of one day, but imminent. Her family was coming. Finally, after waiting so long, they were coming. For Kiva, but also for Tilda. They were coming for the Rebel Queen. And the inside blurb says, here at Zalandov, the only person you can trust is yourself. 17-year-old Kiva Meriden has spent the last 10 years fighting for survival in the notorious death prison, Zalandov, working as the prison healer. When the Rebel Queen is captured, Kiva is charged with keeping the terminally ill woman alive, long enough for her to undergo the trial by ordeal, a series of elemental challenges against the torments of air, fire, water, and earth, assigned to only the most dangerous of criminals. Then a coded message from Kiva's family arrives, containing a single order. Don't let her die. We are coming. Aware that the trials will kill the sickly queen, Kiva risks her own life to volunteer in her place. If she succeeds, both she and the queen will be granted their freedom. But no one has ever survived. With an incurable plague sweeping Zalandov, a mysterious new inmate fighting for Kiva's heart, and a prison rebellion brewing, Kiva can't escape the terrible feeling that her trials have only just begun. So that is the two blurbs. There is when they send notes and stuff, they do send it in their own secret language. So it is a series of just symbols, sort of similar to Wingdings, but it's not Wingdings. So I will describe I would just say that they're symbols, and other pages that have certain things on, I would just sort of describe. The first couple of pages do also have a map of the whole kingdom of Wenderall, which is where the it's set, and then also one of Zavendorf Prison. So I do suggest you get this book. If you have this book, feel free to have a look at the maps and familiarize yourself with it. But apart from that, I think that's all I need to say, so let's get into it. And I almost forgot to take that off. So yeah, welcome to Skievers Idle Book Club. So we'll start by setting up some cookies to go. So Sharky gave me lots of instructions. So we've got an achievement there. So we'll just wait till there's a few more achievements before we do anything. So I think I'll just do 100 cookies and then I'll start buying some stuff. Or maybe I'll do 115 so that I can buy whatever, because that thing there's 100 and then there's 503,000. So okay, let's buy a cursor. So auto clicks once every 10 seconds. So we'll have that. Thanks. We'll buy a grandma, who is a nice grandma to bake more cookies. She's gonna bake me some cookies. And I will just get a couple of, so let's look at these achievements. So, wake and bake. Bake 1 cookie. Making some dough. Bake 100 cookies. Click, have 1 cursor. Double click, have 2 cursors. Grandma's cookies, have 1 grandma. So, the more of those cursors and stuff we have, the more cookies will be created. So I'll just do some more clicking and then buy some more stuff. So we have 6. So over here it says 6, and we have 1 grandma. So let's maybe get a couple more going. So let's go up to 10 cursors, and then we'll get some grannies. So, why don't you visit more often, Grandma? Because my grandma isn't here. Yeah, I'm gonna have an army of grandmas. I wonder what the other ones are. So let's do some cursors. 8, 9. Oh, I can't do 9. 53. So let's go 53. 10. And let's go. I don't know how many grannies we want. Oh, what's this up here? Reinforce index finger. So the mouse gains +1 cookie per click, and the cursor gains plus 0.1. So let's do that. As well. Casual baking, we've got another achievement. Grandma. That's 100, so I've got 2 grandmas. And I think 2 grandmas now will make me, each grandma produces 0.5 cookies per second. So I'm getting 1 cookie per second from my 2 grandmas. And sometimes there's golden cookies that randomly appear, and they either give you a bonus or they give you just straight up cookies. Three grandmas. You smell like coffee. That's what happens when you spill coffee on yourself. Did you have Starbucks again? Or Greg's? Oh, there we go. Here we go. Here's a golden cookie. So I'm going to click on it. Achievement unlocked. Golden cookie. Lucky plus 43 cookies. So I just got 43 cookies from clicking on that bad boy. Look at all those cookies going up too. Starbucks because Greg's coffee tastes like this stuff. I mean, it probably wouldn't taste different to me because coffee just tastes yuck to me, so. But I get you. For those that actually drink coffee, I understand. So I have 6 grandmas, and I'll see if I can go up to 20 curses. So a farm grows cookie plants from cookie seeds. I wish I could grow cookies. I wish that's how it worked. Well, I have some latte sachets, so I'm going to be making myself a coffee each morning to try and keep a regular sleep schedule. Fair enough. So you didn't get that tumbler then? Or did you get that tumbler? To be like, I got some sachets, I'm gonna make my own. So did you get a tumbler? And also, did you get food? And if so, what did you get? Alright, 20 of those. So let's leave that for a bit. I'm going to read the statistics. And then casual baking. Bake 1 cookie per second. So baked right now, bake 1,000 cookies. Clicktastic, make 1,000 cookies from clicking. Golden cookie, click a golden cookie. So, nope, I'm going to shop around. So I need a better travel mug because this one hits my nose when I try to drink from that poor design. Crying face. I feel you there. Alright, we've got 6 grandmas, 20 curses. So I say let's read a chapter. Well, this first has a prologue, so let's read a prologue and a chapter, and then we'll come back and do some more cookies. So, prologue. Death also got a Marmite and cheese panini and a shortbread sauce. Nice. Death arrived at twilight. The little girl was down by the river picking Jerry berry. This is off to a great start, isn't it? The little girl was down at the river picking jerry berries with her younger brother. Their father crouched at the icy water's edge, replenishing his supply of aloeweed. The soothing gel would be needed later, given how many thorns had dug into her flesh, but she could barely feel the pain, thinking instead of the supper that awaited them. Her mother made the best jerry berry jam in all of Wenderoll, and since the silver berries were sweetest when picked just as the moon crested the night sky, she already knew this batch was going to be delicious. If she could only stop her brother from stuffing his face with them, then she could finally deliver enough to their mother to reap the benefits of her labor. The basket was barely half full when the first scream cleaved to the quiet night air. The girl and her brother froze, silver juice smeared around his half-open mouth, concern creasing her brow. Her emerald eyes looked to their father beside the wintry stream, a large bunch of aloeweed in his hands. His gaze wasn't on the mossy plants, but staring up at their small cottage on the hill, his face draining of colour. "Papa, what—" "Quiet, Karen," the man hushed his son, dropping the aloeweed and hurrying towards them. "It's probably just Zuleika and Toril playing around, but we should go and check that." Whatever he'd intended to say, their older sister and brother was stolen by another scream. Whatever he'd intended to say about their older sister and brother was stolen by another scream and a crashing sound that echoed all the way down to where they stood. "Papa," the little girl spoke this time, jumping when her father wrenched the basket from her hands, berries flying everywhere, and caught her fingers in his crushing grip. She didn't get the chance to say more before her mother's shrill voice bellowed out a warning. "Run, Farron, run!" Her father's grip turned painful, but it was too late for him to follow his wife's order. Soldiers were pouring from the cottage, their armour glinting silver, even in the limited light, their swords raised. There were at least a dozen of them. So many. Too many. The little girl reached through the scratchy brambles for her brother's hand, his palms sticky with jerryberry juice, his fingers trembling. There was nowhere to run, trapped as they were with the icy river at their backs, the current too fast and deep for them to risk crossing. "It's all right," their father said shakily, as the soldiers neared. "Everything will be all right." And then they were surrounded. 10 years later. Chapter 1. Looking down at the boy strapped to the metal table before her, Kiva Meriden leaned in close and whispered, "Take a deep breath." Before he could blink, she braced his wrist and stabbed the tip of her white-hot blade into the back of his hand. He screamed and thrashed against her. They always did. But she tightened her grip and continued carving 3 deep lines into his flesh, forming a Z. There's a single character to identify him as a prisoner at Zalandov. The wound would heal, but the scar would remain forever. Kiva worked as fast as she could and only eased her grip once the carving was complete. She repressed the urge to tell him that the worst had passed. While barely a teenager, he was still old enough to discern the truth from lies. He belonged to Zalandov now, the metal band around his wrist labeling him as an inmate. H67L129. There was nothing good in his future. Lying would do him no favors. After smearing Balico sap across his bleeding flesh to stave off infection, then dusting it with pepperroot ash to ease his pain, Kiva wrapped his hand in a scrap of linen. She quietly warned him to keep it dry and clean for the next 3 days, all too aware that it would be impossible if he were allocated work in the tunnels, on the farms, or in the quarry. "Hold still, I'm nearly done," Kiva said, swapping her blade for a pair of shears. They were speckled with rust, but the edges were sharp, enough to cut through steel. The boy was shaking, fear dilating his pupils, his skin pale. Kiva didn't offer him any reassurances, not while the armed woman standing at the door to the infirmary watched her every move. Usually she was given a degree of privacy, working without the added pressure of the guards' cold, keen eyes, but after the riot last week, they were on edge, monitoring everyone closely, even those, like Kiva, who were considered loyal to the warden of Zalandov, a traitor to her fellow prisoners, an informant, a spy. No one loathed Kiva more than she did herself, but she couldn't regret her choices, regardless of the cost. Ignoring the whimpers now coming from the boy, as she moved towards his head, Kiva began to hack at his hair in short, sharp motions. She remembered her own arrival at the prison a decade earlier, the humiliating process of being stripped down, scrubbed and shorn. She had left the infirmary with raw skin and no hair. An itchy grey tunic and matching pants were her only possessions. Despite all she'd been through at Zalandov, those early hours of degradation were some of the worst she could recall. Thinking about them now had her own scar giving a pang of recollected pain. Drawing her eyes to the band she wore beneath it, N18K442, her identification number, was etched into the metal. A constant reminder that she was nothing and no one, that saying or doing the wrong thing, even looking at the wrong person at the wrong time, could mean her death. Zalandov showed no mercy, not even to the innocent, especially not to the innocent. Kiva had been barely 7 years old when she'd first arrived, but her age hadn't protected her from the brutality of prison life. She more than anyone knew that her breasts were numbered. No one survived Zalandov. It was only a matter of time before she joined the multitudes who had gone before her. She was lucky, she knew, compared to many. Those assigned to hard labor rarely lasted 6 months, a year at most. But she'd never had to suffer through such debilitating work. In the early weeks after her arrival, Kiva had been allocated a job in the entrance block, where she'd sorted through the clothes and possessions taken from new inmates. Later, when a different position had needed filling due to a lethal outbreak that took hundreds of lives, she was sent to the workrooms. and tasked with cleaning and repairing the guards' uniforms. Her fingers had bled and blistered from the unending laundry and needlecraft, but even then she'd had little reason to complain, comparatively. Kiva had been dreading the order for her to join the labourers, but the summons never came. Instead, after saving the life of a guard with a blood infection by advising him to use a poultice she'd seen her father make countless times, she had earned herself a place in the infirmary as a healer. Nearly 2 years later, the only other inmate working in the infirmary was executed for smuggling angel dust to desperate prisoners, leaving the then 12-year-old Kiva to step into his role. With it came the responsibility of carving Zalandov's symbol into the new arrivals, something that to this day Kiva despised. However, she knew that if she refused to mark them, both she and the new prisoners would suffer the wrath of the guards. She'd learned that early on, and bore the scars on her back as a reminder. She would have been flogged to death had there been anyone skilled enough to replace her at the time. Now, however, there were others who could take up her mantle. She was expendable, just like everyone else at Zalandov. The boy's hair was a choppy mess when Kiva finally set the shears aside and reached for the razor. Sometimes it was enough just to cut away the tangles. Other times new arrivals came with matted, lice-infected locks, and it was best to shave it all off rather than risk plague of the small beasts spreading around the compound. "Don't worry, it'll grow back," Kiva said gently, thinking of her own hair, black as night, that had been shorn upon her arrival, yet now fell well down her back. Despite her attempted comfort, the boy continued trembling, making it harder for her to avoid grazing him as she swiped the razor over his scalp. Kiva wanted to tell him that he would face one... Kiva wanted to tell him what he would face once he left the infirmary, but even if the guard hadn't been watching closely from the doorway, she knew that wasn't her place. New prisoners were partnered with another inmate for their first few days, and it was that person's responsibility to offer an introduction to Zalandov, to share warnings and reveal ways to stay alive. If, of course, that was desired. Some people arrived wanting to die, their hope already crumbled before they stepped through the iron gates and into the soulless limestone walls. Kiva hoped this boy still had some fight left in him. He would need it to get through all that was coming. "Done," she said, lowering her razor and stepping around to face him. He looked younger without his hair, all wide eyes, hollowed cheeks, and protruding ears. That wasn't so bad, was it? The boy stared at her as if she were one move away from slitting his throat. It was a look she was used to, especially from new arrivals. They didn't know she was one of them, a slave to Zalandov's whim. If he lived long enough, he would find his way to her again and discover the truth, that she was on his side and would help him in any way she could, just like she helped all the others in as much as she could. "Finished?" called the guard at the door. Kiva's hand tightened around the razor before she forced her fingers to relax. The last thing she needed was for the guard to sense any spark of rebellion in her. Impassive and submissive, that was how she survived. Many of the prisoners mocked her for it, especially those who had never needed her care. Zalandov's, some of them called her, the heartless carver. Others hissed when she walked by, but the worst, perhaps, was the Princess of Death. She couldn't blame them for seeing her that way, and that was why she hated it the most. The truth was, many prisoners who entered the infirmary never came out again, and that was on her. "Healer," the guard called again, this time more forcefully. "Are you finished?" Kiva gave a short nod, and the armed woman left her spot at the door and ventured into the room. Female guards were a rarity at Zalandov. For every 20 men, there was perhaps one woman, and they seldom remained at the prison long before seeking posts elsewhere. This guard was new, someone Kiva had noticed for the first time a few days ago. Her watchful amber eyes, cool and detached in her youthful face. Her skin was 2 shades lighter than the blackest black, indicating that she had hailed from Giova or perhaps Hadras, both kingdoms renowned for their skilled warriors. Her hair was cropped close to her scalp, and from one ear dangled a jade tooth earring. That wasn't smart, someone could easily rip it out. Then again, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, her dark guard uniform, a long-sleeved leather tunic, pants, gloves, and boots, barely concealing the wiry muscles beneath. It would be a rare prisoner who was willing to mess with this young woman, and any who did would likely find themselves on a one-way trip to the morgue. Swallowing at the thought, Kiva stepped backwards as the guard approached, giving the boy an encouraging squeeze of his shoulder as she moved past. He flinched so violently that she immediately regretted it. Kiva indicated to the pile of discarded clothes that the boy had worn before changing into his grey prison garb. Take these to the entrance block for sorting. This time it was the guard who nodded, before setting her amber eyes on the boy and ordering, "Come." The scent of his fear permeated the air as he rose on wobbling legs, cradling his wounded hand with the other and following the guard from the room. He didn't look back. They never did. Kiva waited until she was certain she was alone before she moved. Her motions were quick and practiced, but with frantic urgency, her eyes flicking to and from the door with awareness that if she was caught, then she was dead. The warden had other informants within the prison. He might favor Kiva, but that wouldn't keep her from punishment or execution. As she rifled through the pile of clothes, her nose wrinkled at the unpleasant smells of long travel and poor hygiene. She ignored the touch of something wet on her hand, the mold and mud and other things she'd rather not identify. She was searching for something, searching. She ran her fingers down the boy's pants, but found nothing, so moved to his linen shirt. It was threadbare, some places ripped, and others patched up. Kiva inspected all the stitching, but still there was nothing, and she began to lose heart. But then she reached for his weathered boots, and there it was. Slipped down the damaged, gaping seam of the left boot was a small piece of folded parchment. With shaking fingers, Kiva unfolded it and read the coded words contained within. So now there's just 3 lines of symbols with no explanation of what they say. So Kiva released a whoosh of air, her shoulders drooping with relief as she mentally translated the code. "We are safe. Stay alive. We will come." It had been 3 months since Kiva had last heard from her family. 3 months of checking the clothes of new oblivious prisoners, hoping for any scrap of information from the outside world. If not for the charity of the stable master Raz, she would have no means of communicating with those she loved most. He risked his life to sneak the notes through Zalandorf's walls to her, and despite their rarity and brevity, they meant the world to Kiva. "We are safe. Stay alive. We will come." The same 8 words and other similar offerings had arrived sporadically over the last decade, always when Kiva needed to hear them the most. "We are safe. Stay alive. We will come." The middle part was easier said than done, but Kiva would do as she was told, certain her family would one day fulfill their promise to come for her. No matter how many times they wrote the words, no matter how long she'd already waited, she held on to the declaration, repeating it over and over in her mind. "We will come, we will come, we will come." One day she would be with her family again. One day she would be free of Zalandorf, a prisoner no longer. For 10 years she had been waiting for that day, but every week that passed, her hope dwindled more and more. And that's chapter 1. I apologize for that bad word before. Is it? I can't remember. Nope. I can't remember the which one is what. Okay, no. I can't remember which one was for the the adult content. I cannot remember. It's not up here either. Oh no, yes it is. Control Shift M. Oops. Oop. Yeah, expletive. Yeah. Oh well. I shall. At the time I was like, oh, what do I say? So it's fine. So, either that or I would just say the letter now that I've said what it is. So I think it does actually come up a couple of times, but that I think from memory is the worst word in there. So let's buy a farm and another farm, and let's buy a factory. Each factory produces 10 cookies per second. So let's do another factory. Let's do another farm. So 3 farms and 2 factories. So let's have a look at these stats. Fledgling bakery, bake 10,000 cookies. Hardcore baking, bake 10 cookies per second. My first farm, have 1 farm. Production chain, have 1 factory. So nice. Let's have another farm. Cheap. Ooh, kitten helpers. Get some more of those. I go up to I do some cooking, but I go up to 30 of those. Grandma's saying call me at the top. Nice. Can't go wrong with Sherlock. And 1 more, and then I'll get another grandma. 2. Right, I've got 30 clickers. I'll see if I can go up to 10 grandmas. And I think news. Doctors warn mothers about the dangers of homemade cookies. Your cookies now have their own website. I need to get another one of those Sherlock shirts. And yes, it is getting a bit threadbare. Your cookies are worth a lot of money. Thank you. It's at least um at least probably 10 years old. So it's very old. It might even be. When did the first Sherlock come out? Like, I probably got it after the first Sherlock, yeah, 2012. Yeah, so it's probably 10 years old then. I probably would have got it, like, straight up. I was pretty obsessed with it. So, alright. Well, I think we should leave it at that for now. We've got 30 curses, 10 grandmas, 10 farms, and we bought a few other things, so let's read chapter 2. Chapter 2. He arrived like many of the others, covered in blood and looking like death. A month had passed since any new arrivals had appeared at Zalandov. A month since Kiva had been forced to carve a Z into anyone's flesh. Aside from the usual prison injuries and an outbreak of tunnel fever, for which the victims had been quarantined, some of whom had died, and most of whom wished for death, but would be back on their feet once the fever passed. There had been little work for her to do. Today, however, 3 new arrivals, all men, and all rumoured to be from Valenia, the capital of Avalon, the largest kingdom in Wenderell. It was rare for the wagons to appear in the winter months, especially those that came from the southern territories like Avalon. Usually prisoners hailing from such great distances were held in city dungeons or village lockups until the spring thaws, when they would be less likely to perish during the weeks of travel. Sometimes the guards themselves didn't survive the journey through the Belhair Desert and over the Tenestra Mountains, especially when the weather turned to blizzards. Sorry about that. Especially when the weather turned and blizzards swept across the pass. And for those venturing directly from Valenia, they also had to cross the wild meadow and the Krelling swamplands, then cut straight through the heart of the Crying Woods. An arduous journey at the best of times, especially when coupled with the savage treatment of the transfer guards. Winter, summer, spring, or fall, it didn't matter when the prisoners came or where they were from. Travel to and from Zalandov was always perilous. Located in the north of Avalon, close to the borders of both Miravan and Caramore, the prison wasn't easy to reach from any of Wenderell's 8 kingdoms. Nevertheless, all those kingdoms used the prison their problematic citizens transported from all corners of the continent, without care as to whether they would survive the journey. Indeed, of the 3 men who had been delivered through the front gates and sent straight to the infirmary today, only one required Kiva's attention, since the other 2 had already passed into the everworld, their bodies pale and stiff. They didn't yet reek of decay, indicating their ends must have been recent, but that made little difference. They were dead, and there was no bringing them back. The third one, however, the pulse beating within him was a surprise, weak as it was. Looking down at him, Kiva wondered if he would last the hour. Doing her best to ignore the 2 corpses draped across the metal slabs to her right, Kiva studied the living man, considering where to begin. He needed to be washed, not just because he was filthy, but because she couldn't tell how much of the blood coating him was his, and if there were any wounds that needed tending. Rolling her shoulders, Kiva pushed her ratty sleeves up to her elbows, wincing as the coarse grey material irritated the still healing flesh along the inside of her right forearm. She wouldn't allow herself to think about what the guards had done to her 3 nights ago, or what might have happened if the newest guard, the young woman with the watchful amber eyes, hadn't arrived when she did. Kiva still didn't know why the woman had intervened and warned the others of the warden's displeasure. The guards weren't fools. They knew that while Zalendov was ruled with an iron fist, the warden didn't condone abuse of power from his guards. That, however, didn't stop them from violating the prisoners. They just took care not to get caught. The newest guard hadn't yet to lose the spark of honour, of life, in her amber eyes, which usually faded after the first few weeks at the prison, turning into bitter resentment. It was the only reason Kiva could come up with for her interference. But as grateful as she was, she now felt as if she owed the amber-eyed guard, and it never boded well to owe anyone anything at Zalendov. Stifling her troubled thoughts, Kiva collected a wooden pail of fresh water and returned to the man's side. Carefully, methodically, she began to clean him, peeling away the layers of his tattered clothing as she went. Never forget, little mouse, no two people look the same, but we are each beautiful in our own ways. The human body is a masterpiece that deserves our respect, always. Kiva sucked in a sharp breath as her father's voice drifted across her mind. It had been a long time since she'd been overcome with a memory from her childhood, a long time since she'd heard the nickname Little Mouse, something she'd earned from squeaking audibly any time she was startled as a child, a long time since she'd felt the sting of tears in her eyes. Stop it, she told herself. Don't go there. Inhaling deeply, she gave herself 3 seconds to regain control, then resolutely continued her work. Her heart ached at the whisper of her father's gentle instruction, her thoughts involuntary, travelling to the days she'd spent in his workroom, helping with the villagers who had sought him out for one malady or another. Her earliest memories were of being by his side, fetching water, tearing linens, even sterilizing blades, once she was old enough not to hurt herself in the process. Of all her siblings, she was the one who had been born with their father's passion for healing, the one who wanted to ease the suffering of others. Now here she was, about to carve out yet another man's flesh. Her thigh itched. She ignored it. Gritting her teeth, Kiva pushed aside her memories and focused on removing the last of the man's clothing, leaving him only in his underthings. She felt no discomfort at the sight of him laying before her, nearly naked. It was second nature for her to look at him with professional eyes, merely assessing the damage to his flesh. In the back of her mind, she could appreciate his toned build and honey-skinned peeking out from beneath the blood that she continued to wash away, but rather than wonder what kind of life had led him to having such a healthy physique, and what had then led him to Zalendov, she instead feared what it would mean for him upon his awakening. He had enough muscle definition to indicate his strength, which could draw the wrong kind of attention and earn him the worst kind of job allocation. Maybe it would be better if he didn't wake up after all. Berating herself for the thought, Kiva redoubled her efforts to clean him, aware as always of the guard watching her every move. Today it was the butcher who stood in the doorway, having replaced Bones during shift change. Those weren't their real names, but Kiva's fellow prisoners had valid reasons for using them. The butcher was rarely seen outside the abyss, the punishment block pressed up against the northeastern wall. His name was both a warning and a promise for all those who were sent there, few of whom ever returned. Bones, on the other hand, was seen regularly enough around the prison grounds, often patrolling the top of the limestone walls with a crossbow over his shoulder, or stationed in the watchtowers. While not as dread-inducing as the butcher, his predilection for snapping the bones of inmates on a whim meant Kiva was always careful to give him a wide berth. It was uncommon for either of the brutal men to be on duty in the infirmary, but the prisoners were restless of late, with winter's bite making everyone more agitated than normal. Recurrent frosts meant food rations were at an all-time low, the produce damaged by the harsh weather, and limiting what the labourers could harvest from the work farms. When they didn't reach their daily quotas, which they hadn't for weeks now, they felt the effects more than anyone, both in their stomachs and at the hands of the guards overseeing them. Winter at Zalendov was unforgiving. Every season at Zalendov was unforgiving, but winter was particularly hard on the inmates. As Kiva knew after 10 years of experience, She was all too aware that the twin corpses within her reach weren't the only two that she would be delivering to the morgue this week, and many more would end up following them to the crematorium before winter was through. Wiping the last of the blood off the man's chest, Kiva inspected his newly clean skin. Taking in the considerable bruising across his abdomen, a kaleidoscope of colour blossomed onto his flesh, indicating that he'd taken more than one beating during his trip from Volenia. But after some careful prodding, Kiva was confident there was no internal damage. A few deep cuts would require her attention, but they weren't enough to warrant the amount of blood that had coated him. With some relief, she was beginning to realize that the most grievous wounds must have belonged to his deceased companions, and perhaps he had attempted to save their lives by stemming the flow of blood, albeit in vain. Or perhaps he had been the one to kill them. Not everyone sent to Zalendov was innocent. Most weren't. With only a slight tremble to her fingers, Kiva turned her attention to the man's face, having focused on checking his vital organs. Before all else, she'd yet to clean away the blood and grime, so it remained thick enough to make it difficult to distinguish his features. Once she would have begun her work at his head, but she'd learned years ago that there was little she could do when it came to brain damage. It was better to focus on putting everything else back together and hope that the person in question awakened with their wits intact. Peering from the man's filthy face to the equally filthy water left in the pail, Kiva bit her lip as she weighed her options. The last thing she wanted was to make a request of the butcher, but she needed fresh water to finish her work, not just to wash his face and hair, but to more adequately clean out his wounds before stitching them. The patient must always come first, little mouse, their needs before yours, every time. Kiva exhaled quickly as her father's voice came to her again. But this time the heartache was almost comforting, as if he were here in the room with her, speaking right into her ear. Knowing what he would do in her place, Kiva lifted the pail and turned toward the door. The butcher's pale eyes locked onto hers, dark anticipation spread across his ruddy features. I need some... Kiva's quiet voice was cut off before she could finish her request. They want you back in the isolation block, the amber-eyed guard said, appearing behind the butcher and diverting his attention. I'll take over here. Without a word, but with a leering look thrown at Kiva that made her skin crawl, the butcher spun on his heel and marched away, his boots crunching on the gravel path leading from the infirmary. Kiva wished the water in her hands clean enough to scrub away the feeling of his parting glance. Tucking a strand of hair behind her ear to hide her discomfort, she looked up to catch the amber-eyed guard's gaze. I need some fresh water, Kiva said, less fearful of this woman than of the butcher, but still wary enough to keep her voice low to appear submissive. Where's the boy? The guard asked. At Kiva's uncertain look, the woman clarified, the redhead kid with the stutter, the one who helps you with... She waved her gloved hand around the room. All this. Tip, Kiva said. He was sent to the kitchens for the winter. There's more for him to do there. Truthfully, with the recent outbreak of tunnel fever, Kiva would have appreciated Tip's help with the quarantine patients, since the two other prisoners who had been allocated roles in the infirmary struggled with health anxiety and stayed as far away from illness as possible. Because of them, Kiva's workload was such that, aside from the scant hours she was given to sleep each night, the rest of her time was spent single-handedly treating Zalendov's countless inmates, a demanding task even during the winter months when new arrivals were scarce. Come spring, she alone would be carving hands in droves, and that was on top of addressing the day-to-day health concerns of the prisoners. But at least then, Tip would be returned to her and could take some of the pressure off, if only by assisting with small tasks like stripping the beds and keeping things as clean as possible in their markedly unsterile environment. Now, however, Kiva had no helper. She was on her own. The amber-eyed guard seemed to be considering Kiva's words as she took in the room, noting the grimy-faced, heavily bruised, half-naked survivor, the two dead men, and the filthy bucket of water. Wait here, the guard said, finally. and then she was gone. That is the end of chapter 2, and I have lots of things. So let's get a line. $40 cookies per second. Wow. And let's get a shipment. Brings in fresh cookies from the cookie planet. Send me there. Let's go to the farm. Cookie planet. Get another factory. Let's look at these tubes. I thought bakery. Bake 100,000 cookies. Steady, tasty stream. Bake 100 cookies per second. Production train. Have one shipment. You know the drill. Have one line. Is prestiging a thing in this game? I have no idea. You'll have to ask Sharky when he gets back from tennis. Sharky knows a lot more about this than me. We had to have a tutorial this afternoon of how to play this game. So that tells you. I mean, like I sort of knew, but we still had one anyway. $9 million. Well, we'll get up to 10 factories, and that way, after the next chapter, we can start working on the mines. I am a dwarf and I'm digging a hole, diggy diggy hole, diggy diggy hole. $19, $20. Got 20 grandmas. I've got a twitch in my left leg that hasn't stopped for the last chapter. Like a literal twitch, or like a twitch about what's going to happen in the book. Or both. Oh, a little twitch. I was like, it could also be both. Alright, come on, 10k cookies. Hurry up, everybody. How many is my granny making? I'm making 32 cookies a second. Alright, 10k. Come on. 9, 10. There we go. Okay, well, we've been going for less than an hour now. We're already at chapter 3. Or is it chapter 4? Let me have a look. No, chapter 3. And we have made cookies baked this game 173,233. Nice. Okay. Like something is spasming and it's the weirdest feeling. Oof. Uncomfortable. Oh, also thanks for the cheer. I just realised, thanks for the cheer of 100 bits. You did that 52 minutes ago. This is possibly your best idea for a stream yet, in my opinion. Yeah, I think so too. Like, it's much more... Like, I'm much more into this kind of stream, and I can do it long term. So... Oh, that was the message about Much Excite Very book. Right. Right, sorry. I didn't realise that. Because it didn't come up in the chat. I don't think. Let me have a look. Or maybe. Is that why it had 100 there? I don't know. I don't know how it looks. It's supposed to look in chat. I would have known if I was on the iPad because it came up in the chat thing as well. Well, there you go. Alright, have a drink. Fair. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. And yes, I agree. I think this is much more, much better stream for me right now when it's too cold for me to try and get my fingers to work. Oh, nice. I was gonna say that emoji does not come up on the computer on OBS, so I had to quickly look at my phone. Alright, back at it again for chapter 3. Kiva didn't dare move a muscle until the guard returned minutes later. With her was a young boy who she motioned past her and into the room. The moment his eyes found Kiva, his freckle-splattered face brightened, and a big gap-toothed smile stretched across his features. With bright red hair and wide blue eyes, Tip looked like a burning candle. He acted like one too, full of energy and crackling with passion. At 11 years of age, nothing ever seemed to faze him, no matter the ridicule and frustration he suffered through every single day. He always brought light with him wherever he went, always had a kind word and a gentle touch for the prisoners who needed him the most. He was even pleasant to the guards, regardless of how rough and impatient they were with him. Kiva. One thing I might say, sorry, I'll just stop there for a second. One thing I might say is you might want to turn the sound up a bit next time. It's okay if I put you on 100. So, like my sound. Because I can turn my sound up if need be. So, I will continue reading. You can tell me in the chat. Kiva had never met anyone like Tip, certainly not in a place like Zalandov. Kiva, Tip said, rushing forward. He looked for a moment as if he might try and hug her, as if they hadn't seen each other in years rather than days. But he resisted at the last second, reading her body language. I didn't know what Nari was bringing me over here for. I was... He pulled a face and tried a different word. I was worried. Kiva looked to the guard, unsurprised that Tip, friendly as he was, knew her name, Nari. At least Kiva would no longer have to think of her as the amber-eyed woman. The healer needs assistance, boy, Nari said in a bored voice. Go fetch her some clean water. On it, Tip said enthusiastically, lunging for the pail, all elbows and knees. For a moment, Kiva feared that the bloodied, muddied water would end up all over the infirmary floor, but Tip was out the door with his load before she could warn him to be careful. An awkward silence descended until Kiva cleared her throat and murmured, Thank you for getting Tip, I mean. The guard Nari nodded once. And for the other night too, Kiva added quietly. She didn't look down at the raw burn marks on her arm, didn't draw attention to how some of the guards had decided she was to be their entertainment that night. It wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the worst time. But she was grateful for the intervention all the same. Nari nodded again and repeated, action stiff enough for Kiva to know better than to say more. It was strange, though. Now that she knew the guard's name, she felt less trepidation, less intimidation. Careful, little mouse. Kiva didn't need the echo of her father's warning. Nari had the power of life and death in her hands. Kiva's life and death. She was a guard of Zalandov, a weapon in her own right, death incarnate. Giving herself a mental kick, Kiva shuffled back toward the surviving man, busying herself by checking his pulse. Still weak, but stronger than before. Tip returned from the well in record speed, the wooden pail filled to the brim with fresh, clean water. "What happened to them?" he asked, pointing to the two dead men, as Kiva began to gently wash the living man's face. "Not sure," Kiva answered, glancing at Nari briefly to gauge her reaction to them speaking. The guard seemed unconcerned, so Kiva went on. "This one was covered in their blood, though." Tip peered thoughtfully at the man. "You think he did it?" Kiva rinsed the dirty cloth, then continued wiping away layers of muck. "Does it matter? Someone thinks he did, otherwise he wouldn't be here." "It'd make a good story," Tip said, skipping off toward the wooden workbench to begin gathering the items Kiva needed next. Her face softened at his thoughtfulness, though she was careful to school it into indifference before he turned around. Attachments were dangerous at Zawandov. Caring only led to pain. "I'm sure you'll make it a good story, even if it isn't," Kiva said, finally moving up to the man's hair. Mama used to always say I'd grow up to be a bard, Tip said with a grin. Kiva's fingers spasmed on the cloth, her heart giving a painful clench as she thought about Tip's mother, Iniki, for the first time in 3 years, having been accused of stealing jewellery from a noblewoman. When Iniki was sent to Zawandov, the then 8-year-old Tip wouldn't let go of her skirts, for he was thrown in the wagon with her. 6 months later, Iniki got cut while working in the slaughterhouse, but the guards wouldn't let her visit the infirmary until it was too late. The infection had already spread to her heart, and within days she was dead. Kiva had held Tip for hours that night, his silent tears soaking her clothes. The next day, red-eyed and puffy-faced, the small boy had said only 5 words. "She'd want me to live." And so he had. With everything within him, Tip had lived. Kiva was determined he would continue to do so, outside of Zawandov one day. Dreams were for fools, and Kiva was the biggest fool of them all. Returning her attention to the man lying before her, she slowly worked the tangles from his filthy hair. It wasn't long, which helped, but it wasn't short either. Kiva debated whether it would need to be shaved, inspecting it closely, but she could see no sign of infestation, and once some blood and dirt were gone and it began to dry, revealing a rich golden colour somewhere between blonde and brown, a lustrous shine became more noticeable. Healthy hair, healthy physique, both rare in new arrivals. Again, Kiva found herself wondering what kind of life this man had come from that led him to fall so far. "You're not going to swoon, are you?" Tip said, appearing at her elbow with a bone needle and a spooled catgut in hand. "What?" Tip nodded down to the man. "Swoon, because of how he looks." Kiva's brow furrowed. Her eyes flitted to the man's face, taking him in properly for the first time. "Oh," she frowned deeper and said, "Of course I'm not going to swoon." Tip's mouth twitched. "It's all right if you do. I'll catch you." Shooting him a look, Kiva opened her mouth to retort, but before she could get a word out, Nari appeared right beside them, having approached on swift, silent feet. A quiet squeak left Kiva before she could help herself, but the guard didn't shift her eyes from a man lying on the metal bench. No, not a man. Now that he was clean enough to reveal his features, Kiva could see that he wasn't fully grown yet, but he was no longer a boy either, perhaps 18 or 19. A year or 2 older than she was, give or take. When Nari continued to stare down at him, Kiva did the same. High brows, straight nose, long lashes, the kind of angles a painter would be in raptures about. There was a crescent-shaped cut over his left eye that needed to be stitched, deep enough that it would leave a pale scar on his honeyed skin, but otherwise his face was unblemished. Unlike the rest of him, as Kiva had learned upon washing his flesh, his back was littered with criss-cross scars similar to her own and those of many prisoners who had endured a flogging or two. But his scars didn't have the characteristic look of the cat-o'-nine-tails. Kiva didn't know what kind of whip had left such welt-like wounds, but the damage was limited to his back, with few other marks on the rest of his body, save the fresh ones he had obtained during the journey to Salandov. "Are you going to swoon, Nari?" Tip's words drew Kiva's attention, and she sucked in a sharp breath at realizing he was questioning the guard. Prisoners should never question the guards. Worse, he was teasing her. Kiva had tried to protect Tip as much as she could since his mother's death, but there was only so much she could do, and now, after this... Nari's amber gaze finally moved away from the young man's face, narrowing as she took in Tip's mischievous grin and Kiva's poorly suppressed fear. But all she said was, "He needs to be held down in case he wakes." Kiva's trapped breath fled her lungs, relief making her dizzy even as she noted where Nari's gaze had moved to and saw what was in Tip's other hand, the scalpel already heated, the tip sharpened to a white-hot point. Of course, not only did Kiva have to patch the young man up, but she also had to carve him. The question was which to do first, but apparently the guard had already chosen, with her new proximity, all the motivation Kiva needed to reach for the blade rather than the needle and spool. Those would come after, hopefully once the guard returned to a safe distance. "I can hold him," Tip said, stepping around Kiva to the young man's other side. He seemed oblivious to the danger he had just miraculously avoided, with Kiva's desperate warning look rolling right off him. "You take his legs then," Nari ordered. "This one looks strong." Strong. The word churned in Kiva's gut. There was no way he would be allocated to the kitchens or the workrooms. He would be tasked with hard labor, there was no doubt about it. 6 months he would have, a year if he was lucky, then he'd be dead. Kiva couldn't allow herself to care. She'd seen too much death in the last 10 years, witnessed too much suffering. The fate of one more man would change nothing. He was just a number, D24L103. According to the metal band already fastened round his wrist by the transfer guards. With the first stroke of the scalpel along the back of his left hand, Kiva ignored the renewed itching of her thigh and reminded herself of why she was doing this, why she was betraying everything a healer was meant to do by deliberately harming others. "We are safe. Stay alive. We will come." She hadn't heard from her family since the last note, and with winter well and truly underway, she didn't expect to hear anything until a steady flow of prisoners arrived again come spring. But she still held on to the most recent words, the assurance, the demand, the promise. Kiva did what she had to. She healed people, but she hurt them too. All to stay alive, all to bide time until her family could come for her, until she could escape. This young man, he was one of the better ones to carve, making her guilt easier to bear. Since he was already unconscious, she didn't have to look into his pain-filled eyes as her blade dug into his flesh, didn't have to feel him shaking beneath her touch, didn't have to see him look at her like the monster she was. Tip knew. He'd seen Kiva carve too many prisoners to count, and he never judged her for it or looked at her with anything other than understanding. The guards didn't care about her task. They just wanted it done quickly. Nari was no exception, not even when she'd first arrived. However, of all of them, the amber-eyed guard was the only one to ever show a hint of disgust. Even now her jaw was clenched as Kiva sank her blade into the young man's flesh. With Nari's gloved hands pressing his shoulders into the metal slab, lest he awaken. Kiva worked fast, and when she was done, Tip was already with the pot of balico sap and a fresh scrap of linen, as if now satisfied with the new arrival wasn't a risk of moving and ruining the freshly carved Zed. The guard retreated to the door, reclaiming her position without another word. "It's a shame about the cut on his face," Tip said as Kiva finished wrapping the man's hand and began to make her way around the rest of his body, adding sutures to the open wounds as she went. and applying the antibacterial sap over the top. Where's that? Kiva murmured, only half listening. It'll ruin his pretty face. Kiva's fingers paused, mid-stitch over the cut she was closing on his right pectoral. Pretty face or not, he's still a man, Tip. So, said Kiva. Most men are pigs. There, there was a loaded silence, the only sound being a quiet huff from Nari at the door, almost as if she were amused, before Tip finally said, I'm a man. I'm not a pig. You're still young, Kiva returned. Give it time. Oh, Tip snorted, thinking she was joking. Kiva didn't enlighten him. While she hoped Tip would stay as sweet and caring as he was now, the odds were against him. The only man whom Kiva had ever held any respect for was her beloved father. But he was one of a kind. Not allowing the nostalgia to overwhelm her this time, Kiva quickly and efficiently finished sealing the rest of the cuts on the young man's abdomen and back, double-checking that there were none on his legs before moving to his face. It was then, just as she lowered her bone needle toward his brow, that his eyes opened. Whoa, look at how many cookies we have. Alright, let's buy some more mines. $20. I apologize for deafening everyone. I read your comment and I literally choked on my drink. I was literally having a drink at the same time. Because I literally read it in the song that I assume you were making it. So it's like the cookies start coming and they don't stop coming. Oh, that hurt a lot actually. It's fine. If you had seen me, if I had a camera going right now, you would laugh. You would have laughed. It's just payback for whatever it was the other day that I said. Actually, how much drink do I have left? That's the only problem. Oh, I don't think I have any. No, I need to get some more drinks. So please excuse me for a moment, and I will pause. Yeah, possibly. I can't remember. Alright, 18, 19, 20. So 20 of those. And I think that's probably get, costs what, 30k? Get that. Achievement. Oh, I can't even remember, so you'll have to tell me later. Because I can't remember. Have one factory. What's this one? Own 100 buildings, eh? Alright. I think that looks good. And I have topped up my drink, so should we get, so let's read chapter 4. I did, but I still can't remember, but it's fine. We can talk about it later. So I don't know what that is. Whew, that's a lot of cookies. Alchemy lab. Might have to buy an alchemy lab next time. Buy some fertilizer. Okay. Chapter 4. Kiva staggered backwards as the young man sat bolt upright. She wasn't sure which of them was more startled. Her, him, Tip, or the guard. What the man started, his gaze moving frantically around the room. Who, where? Easy, Kiva said, raising her hands. His eyes homed in on the bone needle. His eyes homed. Look, this is what you get when I read to you. You get all of this. Like, this nothing on Stephen Fry reading Harry Potter. Did you put your name in the goblet of fire? Dumbledore asked calmly. Okay. His eyes homed in on the bone needle before noting the blood staining her arms. His blood. The next second he scrambled off the other side of the metal bench and was backing away like a cornered animal. Aware that Nari was approaching fast, Kiva spoke again, trying to calm the man before things could escalate. You're at Zalandov. You were hurt on the way here. I've been. She motioned helplessly to her bloodied hands, stitching you back together. It was then that the man's gaze settled on the guard. His eyes were blue, Kiva noted, but there was a gold rim in the center around the pupil. Striking eyes, unlike any she'd seen before. Striking eyes in a striking face. There was no denying it now that he was awake. And yet her words to Tip remained true. She would not be swooning any time soon. Upon seeing the fully armed guard, something in the man seemed to wilt, as if he were finally catching up, realizing where he was, and perhaps recalling why. He stopped backing away, not that there was anywhere else for him to go, since he was now pressed up against the workbench, and he pivoted from Nari to take in the wide-eyed Tip, who stood frozen, with his mouth hanging open. The man peered down at his own body, noting his lack of clothes, and the dressings on his wounds, including the fresh wrappings on his hand. He then finally turned back to Kiva, seeming to come to a decision. Forgive me, he said in a calm, smooth voice. I didn't mean to startle you. Kiva blinked, then blinked again. That's all right, she replied, feeling unbalanced. He had woken up to her hovering above him with a bloodied needle after all. It was she who had startled him. You should sit down again. Let me finish with the cut on your head. He touched his brow, wincing when he found the bump, his fingers coming away red with blood. Kiva bit her cheek to keep from scolding him. She'd have to clean it again now, before adding the sutures. The young man's face paled, as if his sudden exertion had caught up with him, shock setting in. Kiva lunged forward, as did Tip, and the two of them arriving just in time to grab the new prisoner as his knees buckled. "Don't worry," Tip said, barely reaching the young man's chest, but still taking on a good amount of his weight. "We've got you." Kiva, meanwhile, was trying to get a hold of him without stabbing him with her needle. She had already done enough damage to his flesh today. "Sorry," the man said, his voice thinner than a moment ago. I don't feel so great." Then he groaned softly. "Tip," Kiva barked, his name a command. The boy knew what that groan meant as well. Kiva and he rushed away, causing her to grunt quietly as she took the young man's full weight. She managed to drag him a few remaining steps to the metal bench and forced him to sit up just in time for Tip to run back with an empty pail in his hands. Kiva shoved it into place just as the man groaned again, leaned forward, and vomited. "That was close," Tip said with a grin. Kiva didn't reply. She just tightened her grip on the pail as the man continued retching. She wasn't surprised. Head injuries were notorious for prompting nausea. Until she could treat his wound and get some poppy milk into him, he was going to feel awful. If only he could have remained unconscious for a few more minutes. Then at least he wouldn't have to suffer through the last of her ministrations. When finally it seemed like there was nothing left in him, Kiva helped him lie back down, handing the pail to Tip, who was quick to disappear out the door with it. "I'm sorry," the young man said, his voice even weaker than before, his face now alarmingly pale. "Stop apologizing," Kiva told him, before checking herself. He could apologize or not. That was his prerogative. What he said and did was none of her business. Kiva spared a glance at Nari, finding the guard halfway between the door and the man, as if she didn't know whether he was a threat or not, given that he couldn't even sit up at the moment. Kiva wasn't concerned, and the look she sent Nari communicated as much. The guard didn't back away, but her shoulders lost some of their tension. "I'll be quick with this, then give you something for the pain," Kiva said. "After that, you can get out of here." Swiftly cleaning the wound again, and grateful for that the young man kept his eyes closed as she did so, Kiva hovered over him, inspecting the cut, considering how best to stitch it. When Tip returned with the newly cleaned pail, she quietly instructed him to fetch some fresh clothes and watched him run off again, aware that no matter how she closed the wound, it was going to sting. Kiva said, "Try to stay still. This'll hurt a little." The man's eyes shot open, blue gold meeting Kiva's green, causing her to suck in a swift breath. Seconds, minutes, she wasn't sure how long had passed, until she finally tore her gaze away, focusing anew on his cut. His eyes remained on her face. She could feel him watching her as she pressed the needle into his flesh. The slightest of winces, that was the only reaction. Her heart, however, it was pumping double time as she began her sutures. In, out, around, knot. In, out, around, knot. In, out, around, knot. Kiva let the familiar rhythm steady her, aware all the while that the young man was watching her. If that was what it took for him to keep from flinching, then she could deal with her own discomfort. "Nearly done," she told him, as she would any of her patients. "It's fine," he paused and added, "You're very good at that. I can barely feel it." "She's had plenty of practice," Tip said, reappearing at her side. Kiva gave a slight jerk, but fortunately she wasn't in the middle of a stitch. "Tip, what did I say about—" Sorry, he said. "I always forget how jumpy you are." She wasn't jumpy. She was in the middle of a death prison. That was more than enough of an excuse to be on edge. "Done," Kiva said, snipping the last stitches, smearing on the ballico sap. "Helps him sit up, Tip," she said, the last offhandedly, hoping the boy wouldn't comment or question why she wasn't helping the young man rise. In truth, normally she would, but given that her pulse hadn't quite returned to a resting rate after merely locking eyes with him, she figured it was wise to keep as much professional distance between them as possible, and not have her hands on his naked flesh again anytime soon. Let me just get you some poppy milk, then you can... No poppy milk. The two words from the young man were sharp enough to draw Keith's eyes back to his. She frowned and said, I won't give you much, just enough to help with the pain. It'll soothe your head, and she indicated the rest of his bruised cut and carved body. Everything else. No poppy milk, he repeated. Hearing his unyielding tone, Kiva slowly said, All right, how about some angel dust? I can... No, absolutely not, he said, his face having paled all over again. I don't want anything. I'm good, thank you. Kiva studied him, noting the stiffness of his posture, his muscles straining as if preparing for flight. She wondered if something had happened to him under the influence of either remedy, or if perhaps he'd overdosed before. Maybe he knew someone who was addicted. Whatever the reason, short of forcing the drugs into him, she had little choice but to honour his wishes, even knowing it was to his detriment. Fine, Kiva said, but at least let me give you some pepperroot ash. It won't take away all the pain, but it'll help a little. She paused, thinking, if we can find that with some hash willow to ease your nausea and some yellow nut to give you an energy boost, that might be enough to get you through what's next. One golden eyebrow arched, but he didn't question the end of her statement, nor did he argue her treatment options again. Instead, he gave a short nod, the colour slowly returning to his face. Kiva looked toward Tip, and the young boy scampered off to collect the ingredients. Pepperroot ash worked well topically when dusted onto wounds, but it could also be ground into a paste and taken orally, targeting pain receptors in the whole body. Kiva had never mixed it with hash willow and yellow nut before, but the smell of the liquefied combination had her wrinkling her nose and looking at the young man in question, certain that he'd prefer a nutty-flavoured poppy milk or the caramelly angel dust, both of which went down considerably smoother. In answer, he reached for the stone tumbler without a word, swallowing the concoction in one go. Kiva noted Tip's full-faced grimace, and she struggled to keep her own features from copying him. The young man, however, gave only the slightest of shudders. That should kick in within a few minutes, Kiva said, taken aback. She gestured to the grey tunic and pants that Tip had placed at the end of the metal bench. Those are for you. She busied herself by returning the empty tumbler to the workbench, as the young man changed, leaving Tip to help him. When she'd put all the ingredients back in their rightful places, and could no longer act like she had something to do with her hands, she turned around to find the man dressed, with everyone watching her, waiting, Nari included. Looking pointedly at the guard, Kiva said, Isn't this where you step in? She wasn't sure what it was about this young man that was getting to her. All her self-preservation instincts were going haywire. She would never have talked to any guard so directly before today. She hadn't lasted 10 years in this place by being reckless. Nari's dark brown brows rose a fraction, as if she knew what Kiva was thinking, and agreed with her. But just as Kiva tried to figure out how to beg forgiveness and avoid punishment, the guard said, I'm allocating him to you for orientation. Kiva jerked with surprise. She was never tasked with prisoner orientation. She'd done it once or twice back when she'd been in the workroom, but never since undertaking her role as a prison healer. But what about... Kiva started, then tried again. I have patients to see. Nari's brows rose even higher as she looked around the empty infirmary. I think your patients, she nodded to the two dead men, can wait. Kiva had meant the prisoners who were quarantined, but Nari's posture had tightened, so Kiva swallowed her reply. Orientation wouldn't take long. She'd show the young man around Valendorf, find out which cell block he was assigned to, then leave him with his cellmates for the night. Tomorrow he'd be given work allocation, and someone else would take over from there. Fine, she said, wiping her hands, still stained with his blood, on a damp cloth. Once they were mostly clean, she moved toward the infirmary's exit. Follow me. Seeing Tip step forward as well, Kiva cut off his advance by saying over her shoulder, "Can you go and tell Mott that we need a collection?" She dipped her chin toward the deceased man. Tip shuffled his feet and wouldn't meet Kiva's gaze. "Mott isn't real happy with me right now." Kiva paused at the door. "Why?" If anything, Tip looked even more uncomfortable. He glanced from Kiva to Nari and then back again, and Kiva realized that it must be bad if Tip was managing to keep a filter around the guard. With a sigh, she said, "Never mind, I'll do it myself. Can you check on the quarantine patients? Wear a mask and don't get too close." "I thought it was just tunnel fever." "Better safe than sorry," Kiva warned, before stepping out the door. The young man followed in her footsteps. And Nari, too. Kiva looked at the guard quickly, then away again, unsettled by her continued company. It was normal for guards to be stationed at each of the work buildings, rather rarer for the infirmary, at least before the surge in riots of late, but they never tailed inmates out in the open spaces of the prison. There was no need. Dahlendorf had around-the-clock surveillance from multiple watch towers and patrolling guards, both human and canine, the latter of whom were trained to tear flesh from bones at a single whistle. Nari's company was unnerving, prompting Kiva to wonder if the guard suspected the young man was more dangerous than he seemed. It was all the more reason for Kiva to hurry up and get his orientation over with. Deliberating quickly, she turned left and started toward the next building, along the gravel underfoot, crunching loudly in the quiet early evening air. The other prisoners would be heading back to their cell blocks soon, if they weren't already there, but for now the grounds were silent, almost peaceful. "What's your name?" Kiva looked up sharply, finding the young man walking calmly beside her and peering at her in question. Despite his bruised and battered body, and despite his new unfamiliar surroundings, he seemed completely, unfathomably at ease. She remembered her first day at Zahlendorf, the moment she stepped out of the infirmary cradling her bandaged hand, aware that her family, her freedom, and her future had been taken away from her in one fell swoop. She hadn't asked anyone for their name. That had been the last thing on her mind. "I'm the prison healer," Kiva answered. "That's not your name." He waited a beat, then offered, "I'm Jaren." "You're not," she returned, looking away from him. "You're D24L103. Let him make of that what he will." The reminder of how and why she'd been close enough to memorize his identification band. He had to feel it, and know what lay throbbing beneath the wrappings on his hand. Kiva had heard about Zahlendorf's own personal form of branding long before her arrival, and she'd only been 7. There was no way this young man, Jaren, wouldn't have known about the Z prior to being dumped inside his prison wagon. It was an inevitability for all those sentenced to Zahlendorf. She waited for the repulsion and anger, both of which usually came while she was carving the symbol, but he'd been unconscious, so now was his time. She didn't brace herself. There was nothing he could say that she hadn't heard before. D24L103, he finally repeated, inspecting the characters etched into the metal band. His gaze drifted to the bandages, as if he could see through to the 3 deep slashes beneath. "That's a bit of a mouthful. Probably easier if you stick with Jaren." Kiva stumbled slightly, her head whipping toward him, only to find his blue-gold eyes lit with humor. "Humor! Is this a joke to you?" she hissed, stopping dead on the gravel path between the infirmary and the stone building nearest to it. "You do realize where you're standing right now, don't you?" She threw her hands out as if doing so would help open his eyes. While the light was steadily fading and dusk settled over the expansive grounds, the limestone perimeter walls rose high on all sides around them, making it impossible to forget that they were trapped like rats in a cage. Jaren's humor dissolved, his eyes flicking to Nari, then back to Kiva. "You're right, I'm sorry." He rubbed his neck, looking uncomfortable. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to act in here." Kiva inhaled deeply, then shook the tension from her shoulders. People dealt with fear and uncertainty in different ways, she reminded herself. Humour was a coping mechanism, and certainly not the worst of them. She needed to have more patience with him. That's what I'm here for, she told him gently. To tell you what you need to know to help you survive this place. And how long have you been surviving this place? She held his gaze. Long enough to be a good teacher. That seemed to satisfy him, since he followed without argument when she started forward again, at least until she stopped them at the entrance to the next building over and said, I figure the first place you visit should also be the last. When Jaren looked at her in puzzlement, she nodded to the dark doorway and finished, Welcome to the morgue. Okay. That's the end of chapter 4. You were so close, Novak. 2 A's. But yes, that's how you spell it. Just 2 A's. You're getting vibes off Nari, hey? What kind of vibes do you think you're getting? I'm happy for discussions and theories about the book. Well, I've got like millions. I like her, yeah, same. I think she'll be instrumental to Kiva's game. Fair. Believe this is all the sort of things that I also thought when I first read it. World famous bakery, eh? Oh, 50 of them. Let's get some more grannies. One more. And I shall be back in a second as well. Nice, you've done 16 colours. Nice. Also, guess what I forgot to do? Skievers' Bakery. I forgot to name it because there's a chief for renaming it. Sharky did show me that, but then I forgot about it. So let's get an alchemy lab. So we've got world famous bakery, 1 million cookies. Can't remember what else we got. We got this. Transmutation, have 1 alchemy lab. I haven't seen what's in a name, give your bakery a name. I don't know if there have been other bakeries. Grandma's twice as efficient. I will do that. I mean, if there've been other golden cookies, or whether I just missed it. Ooh, a portal, eh? Opens the door to the Cookieverse. And I also asked Sharky because he not long got home. But I also asked Sharky about Prestige, and he said, yes, this game has Prestige. I'm a long way off it, but it does have it. So, let's continue on. Yeah, true. Chapter 5. We're at page 35 already. I'll tell you how many pages actually. 403. So we're at 35 of 403. Chapter 5. Kiva led the way inside the cold stone building, her nose wrinkling at the acrid smell that permeated everything from the walls to the floors. Incense burned from a small work table at the side of the square room, but it didn't hide the stench of death, an unpleasant mix of spoiled meat and sour milk. A drain lay in the center of the floor, the stones closest to it stained a reddish-brown. Only a fraction of prisoners underwent embalming, usually those from more privileged families who were granted permission to collect their loved ones after death. The lingering scent of thyme, rosemary, and lavender tickled Kiva's nose, but she couldn't smell any wine, indicating it had been some time since the last attempt at preservation. Stone slabs were spaced at equal distances around the drain, and while there were currently no cadavers on them, the smell was just as strong as on days when the room was full. The prisoner in charge of the morgue, Mott, was immune to it, but not even the guards monitored this building for long periods of time, unable to stomach the constant odour. "Evening, Kiva," Mott said, sitting on a stool behind the work table, his back slightly hunched, his grey hair thinning on top. "What can I do for you?" I will give you a heads up now, Novak. Mott reminds me a lot of Hagrid. I'm not speaking any quieter, so let me move my mic a little bit closer and let me turn up myself. Alright. Is that better? Okay, we shall see when I'm reading. Just making a note there for Sharky, so. From her side, Kiva heard Jaren whisper her name to himself, and she sighed inwardly. I have two for collection, Kiva said to the elderly man. He was relatively new to Zalandov, having only arrived 18 months ago, too old to be of any use when it came to hard labour. He'd been allocated work in the infirmary, but his fascination with death had made him more of a hindrance than a help. More than once, patients with simple ailments had died on his watch. It had become so problematic that for the first time, and only time ever, Kiva had made a request of the warden to transfer him elsewhere. That turned out to be a boon, since prior to arriving at Zalandov, Mott had been an apothecary, so he transitioned comfortably from infirmary to morgue, becoming the head mortician within a short span of months. Indeed, he had even thanked Kiva for her role in his transfer, claiming that he almost felt as if he were back home. Kiva still wasn't sure how to reconcile the thoughtful old man, who she'd later discovered had been sentenced to Zalandov for deliberately misdiagnosing his customers so that he might trial new experimental remedies, resulting in multiple deaths. But it didn't matter what he'd done outside of these walls. In here, they both had a job to do, and for obvious reasons, the infirmary kept close ties with the morgue. Two, you say, Mott said, shuffling some parchment. Tunnel fever still taking him? Kiva shook her head. New arrivals, they didn't survive the journey. Mott's cloudy eyes shifted to Jaren. Nori had remained at the doorway, and Kiva envied her the fresh air. You're new today, boy? Mott asked, his joints cracking as he stood. Jaren looked at Kiva, as if seeking her permission to speak. Perhaps he did understand the gravity of the being at Zalandov. But she wasn't the one he needed to defer to. Regardless, she gave a quick nod, and he answered Mott with a simple, Yes, sir. Ha! Mott cried with a beaming grin, his brown teeth revealed by the aluminum beacons affixed to the stone walls. You hear that, Kiva? Sir, that's respect. He winked at her. I like this one. Mott. Stay close to your healer, boy, Mott spoke over Kiva. She'll take good care of you, mark my words. Yeah, like Hagrid, except killing people, yeah, exactly. Mott is like a darling. I love Mott. Kiva pressed her lips into a firm line. She wasn't Jaren's healer. She was the prison healer. Everyone's healer. Will you collect them before you finish up tonight, Mott? Kiva said, after unclenching her jaw. Mott waved a dismissive hand. Of course. But they'll have to wait for burning. Grendel's already put a load through today. Kiva didn't care when the other two men were cremated, as long as they weren't decaying in her infirmary. Fine. Tip's checking on my quarantined patients at the moment, but just call out to him if you need any help. Mott's eyes narrowed. Tip? Belatedly, Kiva remembered why she was in the morgue, rather than her assistant. Still unsure of what had happened, she hedged. He'll stay out of your way unless you ask. Do you know what the brat did? Kiva's eyes flicked to Nari, but the guard's back was to them as she faced out into the grounds. There was no way to tell if she was listening or not. Maybe we shouldn't. Gave me a heart attack, he did, Mott said, scowling. These old eyes ain't what they used to be, you know. How was I supposed to see him lying beneath one of those bodies? His scowl deepened. When I came near, he sat bolt upright with the corpse, waving its arms and screaming at me. Thought the dead were coming back for revenge, didn't I? Kiva heard Jaren cough from beside her, but she didn't dare look his way, not when she was struggling to keep in her own laugh. I'll have a word with him, Kiva said, once she was certain she could do it with solemnity. It won't happen again. Better not, Mott said. My ticker can't take another fright like that. As an afterthought, he added, and the dead deserve our respect. The latter was true. Kiva would have a word with Tip. Not just for the sake of the mortician, but also for Tip himself. If he'd been caught, if any of the guards had witnessed his prank, then he never would have left the morgue. A cold feeling overtook Kiva, but she shook it off and again promised Mott that she would give the boy a stern talking to. In return, she received Mott's word that he would collect the deceased men immediately. Satisfied, she was quick to leave the morgue with Jaren in tow, the two of them inhaling deeply once they were outside again. He seems like a character, Jaren commented. Kiva said nothing, casting a quick look at Nari, but the guard didn't betray whether or not she'd heard about Tip's misadventures. If she had, Kiva could only hope she wouldn't care enough to report him. The warden had overlooked some of Tip's foolishness in the past, but only when Kiva had something in exchange for the boy's safety. Prison gossip was scarce of late, leaving her with no bargaining chips and an unsettled feeling in her gut. Looking around the grounds, Kiva pushed aside her gnawing worry and, considering her next move, trying to recall her own orientation. The sights and sounds and smells, all of that had faded in her memory. All she could remember of what she had felt. Fear, grief, hopelessness. The potent mix had clouded all else. Jaren, however, didn't seem overcome by emotion. Wary, perhaps. Uncertain, definitely. But he was also looking at her with curiosity, waiting patiently to see what she would say or do next. Kiva made her decision. Whatever you were told about Zalandorf before arriving here, forget it, she said, turning to the left and doing her best to ignore the crunching of Nari's feet trailing after them. I heard that it's a death prison, Jaren said, that very few people ever make it out alive, that it's full of murderers and rebels. Kiva only just refrained from shooting a look back at Nari to say that this was exactly why she shouldn't be doing orientation for new prisoners. Fine. Yes, you should try and remember all of that, she amended. Are you a murderer? Jaren asked. Or a rebel? Kiva's mouth hitched up at the side, her amusement mocking more than anything else. If you want to survive longer than the night, don't ask anyone why they're here. It's rude. Jaren studied her thoughtfully before his focus returned back to the gravel path. He drew his wounded hand in close to his stomach, the first sign he'd given that he was in any pain, though she doubted the carving was the worst of it. Don't you want to know what I did? He asked quietly. Something you need to know about Zalandorf, Kiva said. Is that who you were out there? She pointed beyond the limestone walls. Means nothing in here, so no, I don't want to know what you did, because it doesn't matter. She was lying to them both, but Jaren didn't know her well enough to call her on it, and he let it drop. Releasing a slow breath, Kiva came to a stop when they reached the next building along from the morgue. It, too, was made of darkened stone, the ground near the entrance dusted with ash, two large chimneys poked out from the roof, one of which was lightly smoking. Zalandorf's 2 crematoriums, Kiva said without feeling. Most of the dead are brought here for burning to prevent the spread of disease. She pointed to the non-smoking chimney. The second is only used when the furnace in the first breaks down, or in cases of mass outbreaks and executions, when one isn't enough on its own. Jaren's brows rose. Does that happen often? Outbreaks? Sometimes. No, his gaze was on the smoke rising lazily into the air. Executions. Kiva didn't dare glance at Nari as she answered. Every day. Jaren's face was shuttered when he turned back to her. And how often en masse? Not as common, but not unheard of either, she shared, almost relieved that he was asking these questions. He needed to know what his future could be if he put one toe out of line. He examined her face, and she let him, hoping he could read how serious she was, how much peril they were all in, every moment of every day. Finally he nodded, wincing slightly when the action jolted his head. I see. And she believed him. There was a furrow between his eyebrows that hadn't been there before, a shadow over his features, a new weight upon his shoulders. Maybe he would survive after all. At least until his body could no longer stand whatever work was in store for him. Come on, there's more to see, Kiva said, heading toward the center of the grounds. They moved from gravel to a mixture of dead grass and dirt as she thought about how best to give Jaren some bearings. Zalandov is shaped like a hexagon, she said as they continued walking. 6 outer walls, thick enough to be patrolled from the top, with fully manned watchtowers at each of the 6 corners. She waved toward the ones they could see from their position, then indicated beyond them. Given your state when you arrived, I'm guessing you were unconscious for the last part of your journey. At his confirmation, she went on. Then you missed the real welcome into Zalandov. Before the iron entrance gates, before the farms and the quarries and the lumber yard and everything else outside of the immediate walls, there's another perimeter fence with 8 more watchtowers. There's also a constant patrol of guards and dogs. She made sure he was paying attention when she warned, don't bother trying to escape. No prisoner has ever made it past the perimeter fence alive. Jaren didn't reply. It seemed he was finally beginning to comprehend the reality of Zalandov. The colour that had steadily returned to his face was fading again, though that could also be because of his increasing pain. Kiva had no idea how long the concoction she'd given him would last. He likely wouldn't be standing for much longer. Inside the walls, there are 4 extra freestanding watchtowers, Kiva said as they approached one of them. A daunting stone building shaped like a tall rectangle rising into the sky, the top section opening out into a wraparound platform. From her position, she could see 2 guards walking along it. She knew more were inside. Together, with the 6 tall towers, they offer a bird's-eye view of the entire inner compound. Someone is always watching. Never forget that. And again, Jaren didn't reply. Kiva kept walking until they were close to the centre of the grounds, as she could get them. The infirmary, morgue, and crematorium are along the northwest wall. She pointed back to the way they'd travelled. If we'd kept following it around, we would have hit the workrooms. Everything from stitchcraft to administration work happens in there. If we'd gone the opposite direction, turning right from the infirmary, we would have hit the kennels, the central barracks where most of the guards sleep, and the entrance block beside the front gates, where the new inmates are processed. Jaren squinted through the twilight in that direction, his gaze slightly unfocused now as his pain took hold. Is that where visitors come to meet us? The question caught Kiva unaware. Prisoners aren't allowed visitors. What? Never? Jaren asked, turning swiftly back to her. He swayed a little on his feet, and Kiva had to resist the urge to reach out and steady him. Does that mean you've never said how long you've been here? She shrugged and looked away. It was answer enough. I'm sorry, Kiva. 3 words, said in his low, gentle voice, and they were nearly her undoing. 3 words from a stranger affecting her enough to prompt the sting of tears. Was that how far she'd fallen? We are safe. Stay alive. We will come. She couldn't be so weak, not in front of Jaren, and certainly not in front of Nari. Her family needed her to stay strong. Pushing through the heaviness in her chest, Kiva straightened her spine and said firmly, There's nothing to be sorry for. My role as a prison healer might require me to help you and others, but I'm in here for a reason, just like everyone else. Murderers and rebels, that's what we are. You said it yourself. Jaren said nothing for a long beat, but then slowly he stated, So, no visitors? When Kiva nodded stiffly, he went on, That's no great loss. I wouldn't want my family to come anyway. A small huff of laughter left him. They'd be even less inclined to visit. A spark of curiosity flared in Kiva. It sounded as if his family were estranged. If he and his family were estranged. And she wondered if that was because of whatever had landed him in here. But then she saw that he was still watching her carefully, and she realized what he was doing. Distracting her, giving her a moment to regain control, offering her a conversational door that she could choose to keep open or slam shut. But why would he do that? This is why she didn't like doing prisoner orientation. It meant she had to talk with them, spend time with them, get to know them. She'd much rather remain alone in the infirmary, seeing them when they were sick or hurt and sending them on their way again. She didn't like this. Closing his office door, his offered door. She promptly returned to her role as his guide. "There's too much for me to show you tonight, and you're going to forget most of it anyway," Kiva said, partly because she wanted to be rid of him, and partly because he was still swaying, and she didn't want to have to carry him all the way to his cell block. "Most of what you need to know will depend on what work allocation you're given, and you'll learn that tomorrow." Walking a few more paces and coming to a halt in front of a domed building made of mishmashed stone, Kiva slapped her hand against the side and said, "Outside of work hours, prisoners can walk freely inside the grounds, so if you ever get turned around, look for the 4 inner watchtowers and then head into the center of them. You'll find yourself here, right at the heart of Zalandov, and you'll be able to get your bearings again." "What is this?" Jaren asked, inspecting the odd-shaped building. "The entrance to the tunnels," Kiva said. "I've heard about those." Jaren raised his unbandaged hand to his head, as if to ease the ache there. "Seems foolish to me, like an open invitation for an escape attempt." Kiva snorted, and Jaren turned to her in surprise. She schooled her face immediately. "It's a labyrinth down there. Miles and miles of tunnels. If anyone was stupid enough to try and escape, they'd never find their way out again. And besides," she added, "most of the tunnels are submerged, at least partially." "Zalandov's water source," Jaren said. "There's over 3,000 inmates here," Kiva shared. "Without water, we die." She jerked her head to the dome building. "This doesn't look like much from the outside, but it's only an entrance to what's below. Everything happens deep underground, not just the digging of more tunnels, but also the pumping of water through the aquifer." She only just refrained from saying that those 2 jobs were the worst Zalandov had to offer. The tunnelers and pumpers. Quarriers came in a close third, followed by lumbersmiths and harvesters. "Now forget about the tunnels for a moment, and listen closely so you don't get lost," she told him, mostly because his eyes were losing clarity the longer they stood there. She turned and pointed. "The infirmary's that way." She pivoted counterclockwise, pointed again. "Barracks, entrance block, front gate." Another pivot, harvest factory for grain and produce sorting, and aluminum depository behind it. Another pivot, kitchens and refectory. She paused to add, "You'll be given a meal schedule with your work allocation tomorrow. Don't skip meals. Rations are scarce, especially in winter, and you'll need all the strength you can get." She waited for his murmured agreement, then pivoted again. "The cell blocks are beyond the refectory. That's where we'll head now. There are 10 in total, 300 or so inmates per block." Jaren's eyes widened. 300? All sleeping in the same building? "Just wait until you see the latrines. You're in for a treat." At his horror-struck expression, Kiva took pity on him. "You'll get used to it. There are 3 stories per cell block, so it's really only 100 per floor. And honestly, in a day or 2, you'll be too tired to care anyway." Assuming he survived that long. Jaren pulled a face. "Is that meant to make me feel better?" This time, Kiva did look to Nari, since this was another perfect example of why she shouldn't be doing orientation. The guard didn't even try to hide her amusement. Turning back to Jaren, Kiva attempted to rally some kind of encouragement. "There's nothing I can tell you that will prepare you for what you're about to experience. I'm sorry. That's just the reality of Zalandov. This place will test you to your limits and beyond, but it's not impossible to survive it. I'm living proof of that." Jaren's eyes held hers, and he quietly asked, "What's your secret?" "To surviving, I mean." She considered her words carefully before answering. "It helps if you have something to live for, to fight for. It grounds you, gives you a reason to get up every morning. It gives you a reason to want to survive. And sometimes it's the wanting that makes all the difference. Because once you give up in here," she pointed to her heart, "then you're already as good as dead." He cocked his head to the side. "What's your something? What are you leaving for?" Kiva arched a brow. "That is none of your business," she started, walking forward again. "Let's get you to your cell block. A few hours sleep and you'll wake feeling much better." Dryly, Jaren said, "Forgive me if I have some doubts." Kiva was well aware that his bruised and battered muscles would stiffen up during sleep, likely leaving him feeling miserable come morning, but proper rest would still aid his recovery nonetheless. This way, was all she said, leading him onward. Jaren and Nari trailed silently behind her for a time, 3 pairs of footsteps crunching as they moved across the dirt and onto gravel again, the breaths fogging the air as the temperature dropped swiftly. While snow was common in the mountains surrounding Zaladov, it rarely fell as low as the prison. Even so, the cold was relentlessly bitter, with ice often coating the ground. The worst days would come after the solstice, which was due in just over a week. Kiva was already bracing for all the weather-related ailments she would have to treat before the arrival of spring. They were close to reaching their destination when Jaren pointed to the northeast wall and said, "You didn't say what's in that direction." Nara cleared her throat loudly, and Kiva wondered if that meant she wasn't supposed to answer. But the guard did nothing more, so Kiva said, "That's where the abyss is." The abyss? Zalandov's punishment block. Kiva could hear the incredulity in Jaren's voice, and he said, "So on top of working us to death, there's more punishment?" Jaren didn't know the half of it, and Kiva really didn't want to be the one to tell him, but he needed to be warned, so she reached for his sleeve and tugged him to a halt, squinting in the low light to catch his eyes. While the watchtowers had roaming aluminum beacons that the guards could pinpoint toward any location of their choosing, the grounds of Zalandov were otherwise pitch black. Once night fell in full, and it was very close to that, with them having wasted the last of the light walking around from the tunnels. "No one knows what happens in the abyss," Kiva told Jaren in a serious voice. "Just that it's bad. The guards stationed there are known for their creativity." She let that sink in. Most prisoners don't come out again, and those who do are changed forever. So if you value your life, do whatever it takes to avoid being sent there. Understood? Jaren thankfully didn't question or argue. Understood. Kiva looked to Nari, and with as much respect as she could muster asked, "Which block is he allocated to?" 7, second floor. Kiva gritted her teeth and headed that way. Of course he was assigned to the same cell block as she. At least they were on different floors, with him being a level above her. Only when they finally reached the long rectangular building that now housed them both and 300 others did Kiva stop in front of a large entrance door. "Head inside, take the stairs to your left, then claim a pallet up on the second floor," she told Jaren. "Bathing chambers and latrines are at the far end of the ground floor. The water in the shower block isn't heated, so move fast and don't get your clothes wet or you'll catch a chill." She made herself meet his eyes as she added, "There's no gender separation for sleeping or bathing, so there's an unspoken rule about respect. The guards don't enforce it, but life here is hard enough without constantly worrying when you'll next be assaulted, so prisoners try to look out for each other." Jaren's brows pulled together. "That doesn't seem foolproof." "It's not," Kiva confirmed, "but it's rarely the prisoners you have to watch out for. As I said earlier, everyone's too tired to cause problems like that." Noting her wording, Jaren asked, "What about the guards?" Kiva looked away, her forearm throbbing in reminder. "They're not as tired." When she turned back to Jaren, his jaw was clenched. Have you ever... "That's another question you should never ask anyone here," Kiva interrupted firmly. She was aware of Nari standing only a few paces away, silent and still. Jaren looked like he was about to argue, but then he raised his good hand and ran it agitatedly through his hair, instead asking, "Is there anything else I should know?" Kiva faced him dead on. "There's lots you should know, but the one thing you need to remember is this. Here at Zalandov, the only person you can trust is yourself." And with that, she turned on her heel and strode back toward the infirmary, his orientation officially complete. That felt like a long chapter. And we got like 5 million cookies, so let's get a portal. Achievement unlocked. A whole new world. A new fantastic point of view. Alright, let's get some shipments. 23. Mass producer, eh? Let's have a look. Stats. Mass bake 10,000 cookies per second. And I have one total. Nice. Only about 7. Why is my milk looks like it's turning into chocolate milk? Chocolate milk. Child labor. Factories are twice as efficient. How awkward. Let's get some child labor. That is terrible, but get some grandmas, working grandmas. Working 9 to 5. What a way to make cookies. Oh, there was one. A frenzy. Cookie production times 7 for 77 seconds. Alright, let's click. Let's click as well. Look at how good. Cosmic Bakery. I will look at that once this is gone. This is good. I need to get cookies. Cookies. Cookie starts with C. C is for cookie. That's good enough for me. So there's a bar right down the bottom here that shows it going down. So I'm just like click, click, click. Clickathon. Skievers' Bakery. Maybe I should rename the bakery again. I will in a second. Come on. Come on, click faster. I can't click faster. I'm too slow. Ah, nice. Alright, let's see what those were. This one. Bake 10 million cookies. And what's this one? Make 100,000 cookies from clicking. Nice. Skievers and Sharky's Bakery. Sharky's Bakery. I made a mistake in typing. There we go. Skievers and Sharky's Bakery. That's better. Alright, I've got 7 million cookies, so 14. At least get one more. And it's going to take me forever because it's like 1.5 million almost, 1.4 million. Use chocolate mines found to cause earthquakes and sinkholes. Alright, 15. I'll get 15. And I'll get some more after the next chapter. So what, there's 403 pages and we're up to 49. So we're doing pretty good. Pretty good. Let me just check this. $354 pages left. So, let's get into it. I probably should have had that this is a mature stream. Yep. I probably should have had somewhere that this is a mature stream because this book has some mature content in it. So next stream I will have it up and sorted out for that. I just got so many cookies, it's like not even funny. 1,000 fingers. Cookie trees. Well, what's that? What is that? Kitten workers. Cute. Maybe I should be saving up for that. 9 million kitten helpers. With more milk you have. What are these? Plain cookies. Peanut butter cookies. Oatmeal, ew. Sugar cookies. 100 million. Insane oatling workers. Well, we shall see. Okay. I hear one of the new arrivals survived, Warden Rook said, sipping amber liquid from a crystal tumbler. Standing tall and proud, he peered through his window atop the southern wall. While most of the guards had personal quarters within the barracks, the warden lived high above them all, watching, always watching. Not his companions? Kiva shook her head, perched stiffly in his sitting room, barely an hour after leaving Jaren with Nari outside their cell block. Both dead. Rook murmured, swirling his liquor. With dark skin, cropped hair, and a short beard, he looked like many of the other burly guards, but it was his scar that set him apart, cutting above and below his right eye like an interrupted diamond. That and the authority that dripped off him, enhanced by his black leather uniform all the way down to his perfectly polished boots. The survivor was covered in blood. Is he badly damaged? Careful. Always so darn careful about the information she shared. Kiva answered, nothing permanent. Warden Rook smiled, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. Good. That's good. Another able-bodied male. That was all that mattered to the warden. Never mind that Zalandov was already bursting at the seams, even with the excessive mortality rate. In the 10 years Kiva had lived at the prison, she'd come to accept that the warden wasn't an evil man, but he was coldly pragmatic and powerful. So very powerful. With a heavy burden of responsibility on his shoulders, his jurisdiction over Zalandov meant he answered not to one kingdom, but to all of them, since all of their condemned citizens were jailed under his watch. But while he did have to obey direct orders from the rulers of all 8 territories, he was mostly left to his own devices, trusted to oversee the day-to-day management of the inmates and guards without supervision. How he did that was his business. Kiva held little love for Warden Rook. Her allegiance to him was a means for survival, nothing more. But even so, she knew that she and her fellow inmates could have done a lot worse. Rook, at least, had a sense of mortality. Limited as it was, she didn't want to imagine what might happen if the butcher or Bones or any of the other more abusive guards were given the position of warden. Nothing would be left but blood and ashes. "Have you anything else to tell me tonight, Kiva?" The warden was watching her closely. He was smart, she knew. Too smart for her liking. He lived and worked among the worst kinds of people, and had long since learned how to read them. How to read her. "The prisoners are unhappy," she answered, "but you already know that." Rook sighed, taking another sip of his drink. "There's always trouble at this time of year. They're hungry, cold, tired. There's little I can do about any of that." Kiva disagreed, but she remained silent. More food rations, warmer clothes and blankets, shorter work hours, these were all things the warden could change, but the prisoners weren't supposed to be comfortable. None of them were in Zalandov for a holiday. They were here to work, and then to die. "What about the rebels?" Rook asked. Kiva shifted in her seat, the warden tracking her every move. "Is Cresta still leading them?" he prompted. Licking her lips, Kiva nodded slowly and said, "As far as I'm aware." Rook's eyes narrowed as he repeated, "As far as you're aware?" Kiva forced herself to meet his gaze. "The rebels don't like me, especially Cresta." Kiva couldn't blame them, as Rook's informant, reluctant or not, she well earned their scorn. "They don't keep me apprised of their leaders or their plans." That was about as close as Kiva ever dared to show any kind of backbone. But after years of these meetings with the warden, she felt safer with him than any other guards. She had no reason to, even if she knew her allegiance didn't guarantee her safety. The warden rubbed his temple. "Kiva, you know I respect you. Care for you, even. You've proved your skills as a healer time and time again, and you've earned my regard through your years of service. Because of that, I must warn you." Kiva braced herself. "The day is coming when I'm going to need more from you," Rook continued. "The rebels within the prisons are becoming a problem. I can only assume it's because their movement outside is advancing. With rebel numbers growing every day, as the queen of theirs leads them to slaughter, the fools." Rook shook his head, as if pitying them. Kiva's heart rate doubled. Any mention of the outside world had her aching for more. In the last decade, she'd only managed to hear snippets of what was happening beyond Zalandov's walls. When she'd first arrived at the prison, the rebel movement had been little more than a group of impassioned nomads searching for their long-lost queen, whispering about how she had a legitimate claim to the throne of Avalon. Treasonous words with grave consequences for those caught by the royal guard. It was only after Kiva's imprisonment that she heard their queen had come out of hiding and was now leading their cause, seeking one thing: vengeance. Not justice, not a chance to debate why the crown belonged to her. No, the rebel queen wanted revenge for all that had been taken from her, for all that she'd lost, for the kingdom and its power that should have been hers at birth. From what Kiva had gleaned over the last few years, the rebel queen was slowly, very slowly, beginning to take ground. Rook called them fools. Kiva wasn't so sure. "They have an energy, a spark, that's building," the warden went on, still talking about the imprisoned rebels. "It might not be much yet, but the smallest spark can cause a flame, and I want to avoid that for their sakes." Kiva shuddered at the look in his eyes. The rebels inside Zalandov would meet a swift death if Rook or any of the guards caught so much as a hint of them plotting anything. Whether it was escape on their minds, or something simpler, like stirring up the other prisoners, or even rallying more numbers to their side, it didn't matter. If they acted out in any way, their lives would be forfeited. It was difficult for Kiva to feel compassion for them. They should have been smarter, should have kept their heads down, rather than being careless enough to draw the warden's attention. They'd dug their own graves as far as she was concerned. Her expression must have told Rook as much, since he sighed again, louder this time. "Just see what you can learn before I next summon you," he said, throwing back the last of his liquor. He locked eyes with her and finished. Skilled healer or not, I can find others to work in the infirmary. Your worth lies in what you can tell me. I need more information, Skievers. Better information. He turned to look out the window again, his dismissal clear, leaving Skievers to be escorted down from the wall by another guard, her heart heavy and her stomach knotted. She couldn't give Rook what he wanted. She hadn't lied to him. Zalandov's rebels loathed her, seeing her as little more than the warden's spy. Their assumed leader, Cresta, was the last person in the world who would ever trust Skievers with information. And yet Skievers would do as she always had. She would find a way to meet Rook's demands. She would live another day. She had to, if she ever wanted to see her family again. One way or another, whatever it took, she would figure out how to glean the knowledge he desired. And I'm going to read another chapter because that was quite a short chapter. So, chapter 7. Jaren was allocated work in the tunnels. It was Tip who told Skievers. Tip, who had left the infirmary in a hurry upon Skievers' return that night, hastening back to their shared cell block to make sure Jaren snagged a pallet next to his. Tip, who had whispered Zalandov's secrets to the newcomer, all the warnings and hints that Skievers had failed to offer. Skievers told herself that Jaren was just like any other prisoner, that she didn't want or need Tip's frequent updates. With Jaren's work allocation, there was no way she was going to invest time or energy into getting to know him further, even if she'd wanted to, which she didn't. Sounds like denial to me. She had enough to worry about, and he had a clock ticking down to his death now. Skievers knew the odds. 30% of tunnelers didn't survive their first 6 weeks, and 50% didn't live longer than 3 months. Jaren was a dead man walking. It was a shame, Skievers supposed, but that was life at Zalandov. Instead of dwelling on Jaren's inevitable demise, Skievers found herself grateful that his arrival had given back her assistant. Tip hadn't been reallocated to the kitchens, so he was still helping her in the infirmary with the quarantine patients. She had an inkling that Nari was responsible for his permanent return, though the guard herself hadn't been assigned to the infirmary since Jaren's orientation. Skievers almost missed the stoic young woman, especially when Bones or the butcher was on duty. Sometimes, however, there was no guard, which was an indication that things were getting back to normal at Zalandov. There had been no riots in some time, and while Rook had claimed that the rebels were a growing problem, they were keeping quiet, for now. Slowly but surely, the quarantine lifted, the patients who survived their battle with tunnel fever returning to their jobs, and those who didn't being sent to the morgue. 10 days had passed. Skievers settled back into her routine, caring for prisoners who came and went, while keeping an ear out for anything she might be able to pass along to the warden. Soon she was too burdened by her workload to give his task more than a passing thought. With winter causing problem for all inmates, regardless of their allocations, the outdoor labourers battled hypothermia and frostbite, while the underground workers were hit by a sweating sickness, the water in the tunnels prompting a smorgasbord of bacterial infections. The growing array of health concerns left Skievers too busy to think about anything or anyone. But then, 11 days after Jaren's arrival, just after Tip took off for dinner, Skievers was finalising her weekly inventory when a voice spoke from the infirmary doorway. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Skievers whirled around to find Jaren standing there. It was the first time she'd seen him since his orientation. "You look terrible," Skievers couldn't keep from saying as she stood and motioned him inside. A quiet laugh left Jaren as he moved stiffly towards her. "That's some bedside manner you have." Skievers didn't deny it. "I'm surprised you're still alive. I thought for sure I'd be sending you to the morgue by now." Another laugh, this one louder. "And your compliments keep coming." Skievers didn't allow herself to feel relieved that not only was he still standing, but he seemed to be in good spirits. He'd lasted nearly a fortnight, which was longer than others could say, especially those allocated to the tunnels. "What can I do for you, Jaren?" She realized her mistake immediately, but it was too late for her to go back in time and call him by his identification number. Instead, she ignored his satisfied expression and tapped her foot impatiently. Tip said I should come by and get my stitches taken out. Jaren scratched his jaw and admitted. He said 10 days, so I'm a day overdue, but yesterday was long, and I fell asleep right after dinner. He kept all emotion from his voice, an indication that he wasn't seeking pity or compassion, so Kiva offered neither. Have a seat, she told him, before collecting what she needed from the work table. Jaren groaned slightly as he eased himself onto the nearest metal bench. And while Kiva showed no outward reaction, she winced internally, aware of just how hard the tunnelers were made to work. She was surprised Jaren hadn't come to see her before now to stock up on painkillers and anti-inflammatories. At the very least, a muscle relaxant would have helped, especially during his first few days as he acclimatized to the labor. Any problems I should know about? Kiva asked as she approached. Itching, swelling, redness? Jaren looked amused. Shouldn't you have checked in before now to ask about all that? I'm not your mother, Kiva said. You're responsible for your own health in here. There's that bedside manner again, Jaren said under his breath. Kiva acted like she didn't hear and reached for his left hand. His skin was filthy, highlighting that he'd come straight from the tunnels after his shift had ended. Dirt and grime covered him from head to toe, almost as much as when he'd first arrived at Valendov, though without the addition of blood this time. This has healed well, Kiva said, inspecting the carved symbol. It had scabbed over, one of the slashed lines already having peeled away to reveal a fresh pink scar beneath. She turned his hand so that his palm faced upward, grimacing when she saw the bloodied blisters and broken calluses. Nice, huh? Jaren said. Some of the guards think we're slacking off underground, so at least these offer irrevocable proof that I'm working. He wiggled his fingers. Kiva stopped his movement by trailing a sponge of salty water over his hand, prompting him to curse quietly at the sting. You need to keep these clean so they'll get infected, she told him, mercilessly scrubbing away the dirt. You know as well as I do how impossible that is, he returned. Kiva didn't argue. Oh, sorry, I see a funny line coming up. So once she was done cleaning both his hands and slathering them in Balico sap, she said, Take off your shirt and lie down. I'm flattered, but we barely know each other. Kiva's gaze jerked up to his face. His features may have been smeared with dust and lined with exhaustion, but his blue gold eyes were dancing. She leaned in close and hissed, You can take this seriously or you can leave, she pointed to the door. I'm sure Tip will be happy to remove your stitches back in the cell block. But Tip doesn't have your delightful people skills, Jaren replied with a grin, grabbing the hem of his tunic and pulling it over his head before promptly lying on the bench. Kiva noted the differences in his body with a professional eye. The bruising on his abdomen had faded significantly, now only a slight greenish-yellow tinge remaining. He'd lost a little weight, but that was to be expected. His muscle mass was still good, perhaps even greater than when he'd first arrived, especially in his arms and torso, but again, that was normal given his arduous work allocation. What's the verdict, prison healer? Am I dying today? Kiva stopped her examination, only to find his gaze on her. While she hadn't been admiring him in any way, warmth crept into her cheeks, as if she'd been caught ogling him. Appalled by her unfounded reaction, she answered, The day's not over yet. His abdominal muscles rippled as he chuckled, and Kiva gritted her teeth, reaching for her supplies. Hold still, she said as she began to cut away the stitches. The wounds had healed perfectly, and she cleaned them as she went, leaving behind healthy pink flesh. When she was done with Jaren's front and asked him to turn over onto his stomach, he hesitated. Kiva guessed that it was reaction to the scars on his back, but she'd already seen those. Jaren seemed to remember this and did as she'd asked, though with notable reluctance. Unable to curb her curiosity, while Kiva snipped away the stitches she'd placed on his right shoulder blade, she commented, I see a lot of scars, but these ones are interesting. She brushed her finger over one of the welts, and Jaren tensed beneath her. Kiva knew it was none of her business, and yet she couldn't keep from asking what caused them. I just want to say that I'm going to give a warning for like abuse. So if this makes you uncomfortable, probably mute or don't listen for the next 5 minutes. The silence that fell was so heavy that Kiva was sure Jaren wasn't going to answer, but he surprised her when he finally said, "Belt buckles mostly. Some are from fingernails, one or two from a wooden cane or a broken vase. I think one's even from the spine of a book, whatever was in easy reach at the time." Kiva's hands froze. "You mean, did someone... You see a lot of scars, remember?" Jaren interrupted. "Don't tell me you're shocked." Kiva didn't know what to say. She continued snipping at the stitches, moving on to the next wound. Yes, she saw plenty of scars, but the ones similar to Jaren's were always from a whip of some kind, as punishment for errant behaviour. When Kiva had 3 lines of scars on her back from a lashing she'd received during her early years at Zalandov, the first and only time she'd refused to carve someone's flesh. What Jaren was saying, though, it sounded like... "Was it someone close to you?" Kiva asked quietly. A long exhalation before he answered. "Yes." Kiva could feel the tightness of his body, and she knew he wouldn't be answering anything else. He'd already said more than she would have if their positions were reversed. "Well, now you can add a few more scars to your list," she said, infusing lightness into her voice as she smeared Balico sap over the raw skin. "You can sit up again." Jaren did so, swinging his legs over the metal bench. His face was closed, his gaze downcast, as if desperate to avoid eye contact after what he'd just admitted. He didn't make a move for his tunic, and Kiva didn't want him to think she was uncomfortable with his state of undress, so she said nothing other than, "Lucky last," as she pointed to the cut on his head. It was strange, doing this with him sitting upright. She realized that she should have kept him lying down for it, but she had no valid reason to make the request now, other than that she felt odd standing so close to him. "Has this wound caused you any discomfort?" Kiva asked as she cleaned away the tunnel dust. "Headache, nausea, memory problems, sight issues?" "The first 2 days were unpleasant, but the pain eased after that," Jaren said. "Contrary to what you might think, I'm not an idiot. I would have come back if I was worried about anything." Kiva said noncommittally. "I've had a concussion before," Jaren defended as she began removing the sutures. "Twice, actually. I know what to watch out for." Given their close proximity, Kiva found it less awkward to have him talking rather than just staring at her, so she prompted, "What happened?" Jaren shifted slightly, and Kiva sent him a warning look. She was working dangerously close to his eye. "The first was a riding accident. My horse spooked when I was out hunting, and I fell headfirst into a ditch." Kiva considered that he'd inadvertently given away what he'd inadvertently given away. He must come from a wealthy family to have been on a hunting expedition. Usually the sport was reserved for those in or close to the upper social circles. Sometimes merchants and scholars were invited if they had ties to aristocracy. Aristocracy? I'm not sure. I know how to pronounce the first part of that word, but I don't know if the second part's right. But anyway, but only the most successful ones. If Jaren came from a high-standing family, it made sense that they'd be unwilling to visit him in Zalandov. They'd likely disowned him from the moment of his sentencing. Aristocracy. But only the most successful ones. If Jaren came from a high-standing family, it made sense that they'd be unwilling to visit him in Zalandov. They'd likely disowned him the moment of his sentencing. "And the second time?" she asked. "I was teaching my brother how to climb trees, and I slipped." He winced. "Not my finest moment." "You have a brother?" "Yeah, he's around Tip's age. Bit of a surprise for my mother." He paused, then added, "I have a sister too, but she's older." So you're the middle child, Kiva observed. That explains a lot. A joke from the prison healer? Jaren squinted at her. Are you sure I'm not dying? Kiva didn't deign to respond as she snipped the last stitch, smeared on some sap, and retreated to a safe distance, indicating for him to pull his tunic back on. How much longer do you have to stay here tonight? Jaren asked, his gaze wandering around the infirmary. She tried to see it from his perspective. The metal benches, the wooden work table covered with supplies, the thin blanketed pallets, with even thinner privacy curtains for patients who needed longer care. At the back of the room was a closed door leading into the quarantine room, currently occupied by a few cases of stomach virus that was going around. A couple more hours, Kiva answered. Alicia and Nurgle will come and take over when it's time for me to sleep. Unlike many of the other prisoners, Kiva's hours were extensive. Most labourers work for 12 hours, sometimes 14. But as the prison healer, it wasn't unheard of for her to work 18 hours a day, especially when there were wagon loads of new arrivals. Alicia and Nurgle, the two others who were allocated to the infirmary, shared the skeleton shift each night, but the rest of the time they were shuffled among different administrative tasks depending on where they were needed. Unless Kiva was desperate for added support during the day, the three of them rarely worked together, which was perhaps another reason why the two older prisoners were so incompetent. They had no one to teach them how to treat the more complicated health concerns. Here, Kiva said, retrieving a small jar of aloe gel from her supplies and handing it to Jaren. He turned it between his fingers. What's this? It's for your hands, she said. You should have come to see me about them sooner. Jaren cocked his head to the side. Is that your way of saying you missed me? Kiva felt her eye twitch. It's my way of saying they'll only get worse if you don't look after them. Fair point, Jaren said with a hint of a smile. And I guess we don't know each other well enough for you to miss me yet. Another eye twitch. There's no need to add yet to the end of that. We'll never know each other that well. Jaren's mouth hitched up into a crooked grin. He jumped down from the bench, and the move bringing him much closer to Kiva. Her instinct was to step back, but she didn't want to give him the satisfaction, so she remained in place. Maybe whatever Jaren had been about to say, was interrupted when Tip bounced through the unguarded door and into the infirmary. Kiva, did you hear? Hear what? She asked, spinning toward him. There's a new arrival. What, now? Kiva said, frowning. Not only was it still the dead of winter, but it was also night time. Never in Kiva's 10 years of imprisonment had a new inmate been delivered so late. Yes, and you won't believe who they're saying it is. Before Kiva could ask, Nari appeared at the entrance to the infirmary, her face tight. Close behind her came two other guards, both male, carrying a stretcher upon which was what looked like a bundle of oddly shaped rags in a vague outline of a human. Out of the way, boy, one of the guards snarled at Tip, who quickly scampered toward where Kiva and Jaren stood. You, healer, the second guard barked at Kiva as they unceremoniously dragged the limp weight of the ragged clothed human off the stretcher and onto the metal bench Jaren had vacated. You have a week before she's to face her first trial. We want a good show, so you do what you can to fix her before then. And then the two male guards took off into the night, one of them giving Tip a forceful shove as he walked by, prompting Kiva to dig her fingernails into Jaren's forearm to keep him from lunging after the man. She shook her head firmly at him. The stormy look on his face darkened before he let out a sigh and moved to ruffle Tip's hair. The young boy was nowhere near as upset as Jaren. A shove was the least of what the guard could have done, and Tip knew it. Leaping into action, Kiva approached the unconscious woman, listening in as Jaren asked, what did he mean about a trial? To Kiva's surprise, it was Nari who answered, having remained behind with when her fellow guards departed. This woman has been sentenced to undertake the trial by ordeal. Kiva, who had been reaching for the rags obscuring the new arrival's face, froze and spun back to look at the guard. Jaren, too, was staring at Nari with incredulity, though there was something also something else with his expression, something Kiva didn't know him well enough to read. Noting their reactions, Tip asked, "What's a trial by ordeal?" No one spoke. "Guys, what's going on?" Tip demanded. "What's this trial thing?" Kiva slowly turned from Nari to the young boy and said, "The trial by ordeal is only ever sentenced to the most dangerous of criminals. The last time it happened was something like 20 years ago." 30, Jaren said, his features tense as he looked towards the unconscious woman that Kiva remained frozen above. But what is it?" Tip asked. "4 elemental tasks called ordeals to determine a person's guilt. Trial by air, trial by fire, trial by water, trial by earth," Jaren answered as if reading from an archive. "If the person survives, they're deemed innocent." If Kiva hadn't been so shocked by the woman's sentence, she might have questioned the origin of Jaren's knowledge. She herself had heard whispers through her years at Zalandov, legends of prisoners who had received the unforgiving sentence, but she'd known nothing of the trials prior to her arrival. Elemental tasks? Tip's forehead was bunched, but only the royal family has elemental magic these days. The tasks might be inspired by magic of old, Jaren continued cheering. But it's said that if a person is truly innocent, they'll be able to make it through the 4 ordeals without needing any kind of power. So, if this woman does these trials, she'll be able to leave Zalandov free? Tip asked, looking awed by the thought, as if he wished it for his own future. "No one has ever survived the full trial by ordeal, Tip," Kiva broke in softly. "1 or 2 of the tasks maybe, just enough to lull them into a false sense of security, but never all 4. She whispered to finish, "It's a death sentence." Jaren nodded grimly in agreement. Tip paled, then looked toward the unconscious woman. He bit his lip and said, "I guess that makes sense if she really is who they think she is." Kiva finally unfroze her fingers to remove the cloth from the new arrival's face. "Who do they think she is?" It was Nari who answered as Kiva drew the rags away, revealing the woman's features. "It's believed that she's Tilda Quarantine," the guard said, "the rebel queen." Kiva's heart stopped as she stared down at the middle-aged woman, straight-nosed with thick lashes, dark hair and eyebrows. Her tanned skin had an unhealthy tinge to it, and when her eyes opened for a brief second before fluttering shut again, they were milky white. The woman was blind, and with her both shivering and sweating at once, it was clear that she was very ill. All of this Kiva took in with a space of half a breath, because that was how long it took for the shock to hit her. "King Stellan and Queen Ariana want to make an example out of her," Nari went on, "especially since she was captured while recruiting more followers in Miraven, and Avalon doesn't have an extradition treaty with them, given the tenuous relationship between our 2 kingdoms. The best the king and queen could do was petition to have her sent here, where justice could be served, even if they meant they couldn't interrogate her beforehand." Nari looked at the sick woman. "Though, in this state, I doubt she would have been able to reveal anything even if they'd been able to intercept her before arrival." Kiva was having trouble drawing air into her lungs. This blind, sick woman, the most wanted person in Avalon, was now in Kiva's care. The rebel queen, and not only that, but what's this? Tip's voice drew Kiva back from her panicked thoughts. She spun to find him plucking something from the ground, a small scrap of parchment. I think it fell out of her blanket when they moved her off the stretcher," he said, unfolding the parchment and squinting at it. He turned it on its side, then upside down, and a sinking feeling hit Kiva's stomach. "Let me see," she said, her voice croaking slightly in the middle. "It's nothing, just some doodles," Tip decided, but he handed it over as requested. Kiva's heart rate skyrocketed as she saw the familiar coded symbols and translated what they said. So there's more symbols, 2 lines of symbols. Again. The message was clear. Don't let her die. We are coming. Kiva's breath caught as those final 3 words repeated in her mind. We are coming. We are coming. We are coming. No longer a vague promise of one day, but imminent. Her family was coming. Finally, after so long, they were coming for Kiva, but also for Tilda. They were coming for the rebel queen. Kiva swore inwardly. The woman might very well not last the night, and even if she did... For 10 years, Kiva had followed her coded orders, but for the first time ever, she had no idea how to do what she was told, because even if she could save Tilda from her illness, there was no way to keep her from her fate. Her death was coming, one way or another, and there was nothing Kiva could do about it. Chapter 8. Oh, skin intense, the skin intense. Oh, there's a cookie. Whoa, lucky 3.787 million cookies. Look at how many cookies we have. Nine. Whew. I want to get this cat. We got lots of cookies, peeps. Almost at the 9, so I can get a kitty. Kitty, 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 kitty. I'm gonna get a cat and I'm gonna call him Crookshakes. Almost there. 9. I got a kitty. Except I don't know where he went. He just didn't go anywhere. True, but still. I must still do it. Alright. He lives in the achievement tabs with the other upgrades. In here. Meow, may I help you? That's cute. Well, I wish I could name him. I want to name him because he's cute. Look at all these shaves that I got, Sharky. I got lots of shaves. I'll get this one more portal and then I'll read the next chapter. And then, probably after this chapter, I reckon we might be close to finishing because we've been streaming for like 3 hours at this point. And it's like almost 11 PM. Which just showed you like how different, obviously. Nice. Sharky said I'd never buy 10. Oh, I only got 4 of those. You were like, you'll never have enough to buy 10 at a time. You lied, Sharky, you lied. One more. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Nice. Yeah, you have little faith. I don't know if Novak's still awake. I mean, just because he's not chatting in the chat doesn't mean he's not awake, but I will continue with chapter 8. Actually, I'll probably read up to chapter 10 because chapter 8 and chapter 9 are like fairly shortish. Oh, cross-stitching, fair. So I'll read 2 chapters again. Then back to this to do the final wrap-up. So I'll read up to chapter 10. So we've got 10 chapters read tonight. Chapter 8. 2 days passed, 3 days, 4 days, and still no sign of improvement in the rebel queen, in Tilda. Kiva treated her as well as she could, but without knowing what had led to her current state, it was more a case of trial and error than anything else. Her symptoms just don't make sense, Kiva complained to Tip 5 days after Tilda's arrival. They were standing over the woman, with her having been moved to a pallet in the far corner of the infirmary. Kiva was confident that whatever ailed her wasn't contagious, so it was safer to isolate her from those already in quarantine. She's not getting any worse, Tip said. That's something. There's only 2 days left before her first ordeal, Kiva said, and I can't even get her fever to break. She shook her head. At this rate, she won't be able to leave her bed, let alone face whatever they have in store for her. Maybe they'll change the date, Tip said. Give her more time to recover first. Kiva sent him a look that made it clear what she thought of that idea. It might be for the best, Tip said quietly. She's going to die anyway. At least this way it'll be quick, won't it? And she won't really be aware. Kiva hated that Tip was asking her that. Hated that the sweet, innocent boy was even thinking that. As a healer who was glaringly aware of what horrors the human body could be forced to suffer through, she agreed with him. A quick death was always better in these cases. But, ignoring the facts, ignoring what she'd witnessed too many times to count, Kiva's heart ached as she looked down at the shivering woman. Don't let her die. Kiva was doing her best, but she was failing. Seeking a distraction, Kiva turned away from Tilda and asked Tip, "Are you and Mott on speaking terms again?" "I went and apologized like you told me," Tip said. "We're good." Kiva doubted Mott was so easily appeased. "Can you go and tell him we need a collection?" "I was hoping Liku would make it," Tip said sadly, his eyes flicking to the closed quarantine door. "If she'd been allowed to come and see me sooner, she might have," Kiva stated. She'd long since learned to snuff the burn of resentment toward the guards who didn't let the prisoners visit the infirmary until it was too late. "Now go let Mott know so we can clear her bed." Tip took off, and since there was no guard watching the infirmary, Kiva found herself alone with Tilda for the first time since the woman's arrival. "Why aren't you getting better?" Kiva whispered, looking down at the rebel queen. She placed her hand on Tilda's forehead, confirming what she already knew. She was still burning with a fever. It was an effort for Kiva to get any fluids into the woman, rousing her from unconsciousness every few hours to force some broth down her throat. Each time, Tilda stared blankly through her unseeing eyes, saying nothing, little more than a limp weight that swiftly returned to sleep. "You have to stay alive," Kiva continued, whispering as she straightened Tilda's blankets, tucking them into the sides of the thin mattress. "You have to. Don't let her die." Shifting a strand of dark hair from the woman's face, Kiva was just about to go and check on her quarantine patients when Tilda's sleeping body gave a jerk and her milky eyes shot open. Kiva jumped before her senses came back to her. "Easy, easy," she said, her heart racing, unsure if the woman even understood. "You're all right." Tilda turned toward the sound of Kiva's voice. In a split second she lunged upward and reaching blindly, her hands latching first around Kiva's shoulders and then shifting inward when they circled her throat and squeezed. Kiva was so stunned that she didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. She tried to fight the woman off, her fingers grasping Tilda's forearms and shoving with all her might, but the woman's grip was unyielding. "Stop!" Kiva tried to say, but she could barely get any air through her windpipe. She dug her fingernails into Tilda's flesh, but still the woman didn't release her. Desperate, she tried to scramble backwards, but Tilda came with her, the woman's full weight now hanging from Kiva's neck and causing her to lose her balance, the two of them tumbling to the floor. Dark spots began to flood Kiva's vision, her lungs begging for oxygen. Frantic, she clawed at the woman's face, but Tilda dodged her nails, as if she had some kind of sixth sense. remaining just out of reach, her grip tighter than ever. And her hands were gone. One moment Kiva's body was turning limp, her eyes rolling into the back of her head. The next, Tilda's weight had disappeared, leaving Kiva coughing and spluttering on the ground. "Are you all right?" Kiva couldn't answer, still too busy trying to breathe. She was aware enough to know that it was Nari who had asked the question, the guard having been the one to pull Tilda away. Through watering eyes, Kiva saw Tilda wrestling against Nari's grip, fighting like a rabid creature. The guard had dragged her until she was pressed up against the work table, and despite Nari being fully armed as usual, two swords strapped to her back and a plethora of weapons attached to hidden among her leather armor, she wasn't reaching for any of them, instead holding Tilda at bay with her hands. But Nari didn't see what Kiva could from the ground, Tilda fumbling blindly on the work table before wrapping her fingers around a sharp carving blade. "Look out!" Kiva rasped, her voice like gravel. Nari moved fast, but Tilda was faster, striking upward toward the guard's head. For someone without sight, her aim was scarily accurate, and Nari had barely any time to react. It was all she could do to release one hand from Tilda and use it to block the blow, the blade sinking into her gloved wrist. She didn't cry out or reveal any sign of pain. All she did was fling Tilda around and in one swift movement elbow her in the side of the face. The fight left Tilda in an instant, and she crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Kiva was still panting for air, startled by how quickly his struggle had ended. "Are you all right?" the guard asked again. No, Kiva wasn't all right. She'd just been attacked by one of her patients. She was trying to keep alive, to protect at all costs. "Are you all right?" Kiva returned, wincing at how it hurt to talk. She sounded as if she'd swallowed an entire quarry's worth of aluminum dust. Felt like it too. But still, she was the prison healer, and her focus went beyond her own needs to the blade sticking out of Nari's wrist. Following her gaze, the guard looked down and, showing no emotion, yanked the blade out. Kiva flinched, even if Nari didn't. But then she noticed what she'd missed before. There was no blood. Not trickling from Nari's arm, not even on the blade. Rising, Kiva walked on shaking legs towards the guard and the prisoner. Tilda was out cold, a pinkish bruise blossoming at her temple from Nari's blow. Kiva wasn't sure which of them needed her attention first. She took her lead from the guard, who jerked her head at the prisoner, and together they dragged Tilda back to her pallet. Kiva wasn't surprised when Nari reached for the shackles on either side of the mattress, binding both of Tilda's hands before reaching for the chest strap and tightening it over the woman's torso. The restraints were attached to all of the infirmary's beds, including within the quarantine room, but they were rarely used. Despite what Tilda had done to Kiva, she didn't like seeing the woman bound, repelled by the idea of trapping someone so completely, even if that someone had just tried to strangle her. "She's not going anywhere," Nari said. "Now see to yourself." Kiva looked blankly at the guard until Nari prompted, "Your throat? Do you have something that will help?" Unsure why Nari even cared enough to acknowledge it, Kiva nodded slowly and shuffled back toward the work table. Her lungs burned with every breath, her knees still trembled, but she forced herself to think and reached for a vial of tallow fruit nectar. Tears sprang to her eyes as she swallowed it back, the citrus tang stinging the whole way down, but the nectar was the best remedy for throat and lung damage. Kiva considered a dose of poppy milk to help with the pain, but she quickly discarded that idea, needing a clear mind right now. "Your turn," Kiva said, her voice already stronger than before. "I'm fine," Nari replied, remaining in position over Tilda's bed, as if expecting the woman to awaken at any moment and burst out of her restraints. Kiva didn't want to argue with the guard. Everything in her knew how dangerous that could be, and yet— "You were stabbed," she said in a careful tone. "You should let me look at the wound." "I'm fine," Nori repeated more firmly this time. Kiva bit her lip, her eyes swung back to the blade on the table, again noting that it had no blood on it. But she'd seen Tilda stab Nori. She'd seen the blade sticking out of Nori's wrist. "At least let me give you something to clean the wound," Kiva said quietly. "You can do it yourself, but if you don't want me to, but you don't want to get an infection, so—" Nari turned from Tilda, her dark eyes looking on to Kiva before she stepped forward, her jade earring glinting as she closed the distance between them. Kiva wasn't sure if she should back away or not. She couldn't read the guard's expression, and feared she had been too assertive. Nari didn't act like the other guards at Zalandov, brutal and unforgiving, but for all Kiva knew, she was exactly like them. Kiva opened her mouth to apologize, but Nari stopped her with a look and an action. The guard was tugging the glove off her left hand, the one that had been stabbed. As the black leather came free, Kiva's eyes widened. There was no blood because there was no wound, and there was no wound because there was no flesh. Nari had a prosthetic hand, and there at the joint where the skin of her forearm met the prosthesis was an indented mark where the blade had sunk in. "Oh," Kiva said stupidly. Even more stupidly she added, "That's convenient." Nari's lips twitched. "It comes in handy." A startled laugh left Kiva at the pun, and she swiftly turned it into a cough, which prompted bolts of pain to shoot up her throat. Seeking a distraction as Nari pulled her glove back on, Kiva couldn't resist asking, "Do you mind if I ask how it happened?" She held her breath, wondering if she should have remained silent, but Nari didn't seem upset by the question. "I was protecting someone I care about," the guard said, flexing her re-gloved hand. "They made sure I was taken care of afterwards." "And now you're here," Kiva said. She regretted the words instantly, but again, Nari didn't show any signs of any signs of anger. "And now I'm here." It explained a lot, Kiva thought. While still relatively new, Nari had already stayed at Zalandov for longer than most of the other female guards. Despite the high quality of her prosthetic hand, she would be challenged to find another position, let alone be allowed to work her way up through the military ranks. A prison guard was at the bottom of the ladder, and yet because of her limb difference, she still one of the best options Nari had if she wanted to serve the kingdom in a protective capacity. "Does it hurt?" Kiva asked, switching to healer mode. "Sometimes," Nari admitted. Kiva held her eyes and offered, "If you ever need anything for the pain." Nari remained silent for a moment before she finally added, "I'll let you know." Something strange was happening. Kiva knew. A shift in the dynamic between them. The line between guard and prisoner had blurred, and not just because Nari had now saved Kiva more than once. "Thank you," Kiva said quietly, "for helping me. Again." Nari arched a brow at Kiva's words, knowing full well what she'd done. Knowing full well that she'd done more than help, but she didn't correct her. "Just be grateful I arrived when I did." Kiva was, very much so, but still, she said, "There hasn't been a guard here all day. Why come now?" Before Nari could answer, Tip skipped back through the infirmary door, and close behind him were Mort and Jaren. The mortician was no surprise, but Kiva couldn't help from looking at Jaren in question. He, in turn, came to a sudden halt when he caught sight of her, and Mort and Tip both gaping as well. "Kiva, love, what happened?" Mort asked, anger blotching his cheeks as he looked accusingly at Nari. The guard just crossed her arms and meeting his stare. Kiva didn't understand at first, but then she saw where Jaren's gaze was focused. Tip's too. She touched her fingers to her neck, guessing that it was already blossoming into an alarming rainbow of colour. Tilda woke up and we had a bit of a tussle, Kiva said, trying to play it off as nothing. Her scratchy, hesitant voice wasn't helping. Nari arrived in time to intervene. At her choice of words, Kiva could almost hear the guard rolling her eyes. "Oh, I love Nari. She's so good." "I shouldn't have left you alone," Tip said. His freckled face paled as he looked toward the now shackled prisoner. "I'm sorry, Kiva." "I told you to go," she said. She looked at Mott and added, "Thanks for coming so fast." His eyes, too, were on the shackled prisoner. "That's her, then? The one they're all talking about?" The rebel queen, Jaren said for the first words he'd uttered since arriving. His tunnelling duties were finished for the day, so he was free to roam where he wanted within the walls of the prison. Even so, Kiva assumed he was there for a reason, so her eyes scanned him for injury, finding nothing outwardly wrong. So she really is a queen? Tip asked, his face shining with wonder, as if he hadn't truly believed it until now. Not yet, Jaren said, but that's what she and her people want, to overthrow Avalon and take the crown as their own. Or to take back the crown, Mott cut in, depending on which story you believe. Whatever you believe, Nari interrupted, her eyes moving to Kiva. You now have another week to get her on her feet. That's what I came here to tell you. I thought we only had 2 days left, Tip asked, scratching his nose. The royal family has decided to come and witness the first ordeal, Nari shared. They need extra time for travel. For a moment there was no sound in the infirmary, but then... What? Kiva wasn't sure who the loudest exclamation belonged to. All she knew was that she wasn't the only one who had uttered the cry. King Stellan and Queen Ariana are coming to Zalandov, Mott asked, one hand pressed to his balding head. Blimey. No, not them, Nari said. They're too far away, still in Valenia, but the Crown Prince and Princess have both been wintering in the Tenestra Mountains. They've been ordered to come on behalf of their parents. Tip's mouth was open. Mott was looking dazed, and Jaren's eyes were wide with shock. Kiva felt better, knowing she wasn't alone in her surprise, but now she felt even more pressure to do the impossible. Don't let her die. Royal entourage or not, it made no difference. Tilda was still very sick and might not make it to the first trial at all, let alone survive it. So a week, Kiva said. That gives us something to work with at least. She looked over at Tilda, her stomach tightening anew at the shackles. They must really want to make sure justice is served, Mott commented, following Kiva's gaze. Otherwise they wouldn't be coming all this way, would they? Will you tell me the story, Kiva? Tip begged. You've shared bits and pieces before, but I don't understand why she's so dangerous. Kiva looked helplessly at him, then the others. Her eyes landed on Jaren, and instead of answering Tip, she asked, Why are you here? He met her gaze. I came for more of that salve for my hands, but now I want to hear the story. Mott nodded his agreement, and Kiva turned to Nari, hoping she would put a stop to this. Instead, the guard just walked over and sat on the nearest bench, as if settling in. Kiva only just kept from gaping at her, and then it turned into a scowl when the others followed Nari's lead and took their own seats, looking at Kiva in anticipation. I'm the prison healer, she told them, not a storyteller. Today you're both, Mott said. Kiva looked at Nari again, almost desperately, but it was clear the guard wasn't going to intervene. Sighing, Kiva moved to sit in the open space beside Jaren, giving in to their request and sharing the tale she'd begged her mother for every night as a young child. Long ago, when magic ruled the land, there lived a man and a woman, Torvin Quarantine and Serana Valentis, who hailed from two of the most powerful bloodlines of all time. Kiva looked down at her fingers, imagining what it must have felt like to yield such power. Torvin had the ability to manipulate the human body, and to this day he's considered the greatest healer ever known. Serana could control the 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire. A gift no one has possessed in entirety since her death. Together they were unstoppable, and after being joined as husband and wife, they were a king and queen, the likes of whom the world has never seen. I wish I had magic. Kiva closed her eyes as the voice swept across her mind. Her voice, years younger. But even so, she couldn't keep the memory at bay, nor her mother's quiet response. I'd rather you wish for brains or loyalty or courage, my sweet girl. Magic is dangerous, and those who have it are forever looking over their shoulders. That's because of royalty, Kiva had replied. Only people related to Torvin or Serana have magic these days. That's what makes them targets. Kiva shoved the memory deep, deep down and forced herself back into the present. As is the way of humans, those with great power risk succumbing to it, she said, her eyes on Tip, who was eating up the story just as she had as a young child. While Torvin ruled with integrity and had a heart for his people, using his magic to help all those who sought his healing, Serana's powers simmered within her, corrupting her from the inside out. She grew resentful towards her husband, jealous of his generosity and the way their subjects responded to his kindness. The darkness in her built until she decided she didn't want to share her crown any more. She wanted their kingdom, Avalon, to be hers, and hers alone. So she turned on Torvin, a surprise magical attack that left him badly injured. She then lied to their people and said he attacked her, seeking to overthrow her, seeking to kill her, their beloved queen. What happened? Tip asked in a hushed whisper. The kingdom revolted, demanding Torvin's head. Kiva answered, without allies or aid, the wounded king had little choice but to flee. He made it deep into the Tenestra Mountains before he could travel no further. Tip gasped. He died? No one knows for sure, Kiva shrugged. While the queen went on to rule until her death much later in life, Torvin never returned to reclaim the crown that was rightfully his. But there were whispers of those who sought him out, of those who didn't believe Serana's lies and rebelled against her. Some were executed, others imprisoned, but many were said to have escaped, fleeing just like Torvin. Whether those rebels ever found their exiled king or not, Kiva shrugged again. So that's how the rebels came into being, Tip said, a hint of awe in his voice. If the rumours are true, Mott said, then Tilda Quarantine is Torvin's great-great-great-something daughter, right? With a few more greats thrown in? Supposedly, Kiva said, her eyes flicking to the woman. But if your story is correct, then she's not really a rebel, is she? None of them are, Mott said. He ran his fingers over his stubbled jaw. The way I heard it, Serana and Torvin never had any heirs together, but went on to have their own children after they'd been separated. Both bloodlines continued. That means any Quarantine heirs have a right to claim Avalon's throne. They're not rebels at all, assuming they have magic, of course, since that's the real proof, innit? They all looked towards Tilda, realization hitting them at once. The royal family all have elemental powers, like Serana, Tip pointed out. So if Tilda really is Torvin's descendant, shouldn't she have his healing power? She wouldn't be this sick, would she? Kiva found them all waiting for her to answer, so she made a helpless gesture and said, I don't know, maybe she can only heal others, not herself. Maybe magic skips generations. Maybe she's not related to Torvin at all, and this is just a case of mistaken identity. That's a lot of maybes, Mott muttered, but I like your origin story, so I'm going to go on thinking she's Torvin's great whatever daughter, and all that stuff happened back like you said. Don't believe everything you hear, Mott, Jaren said, an indulgent but still wry smile on his face. Kiva arched a brow at him. Jaren caught her look and shrugged. I've heard 1,000 different versions of the Torvin Serana legend. Who's to say which is true? The king and queen must think there's some substance to it, or they wouldn't be threatened by what she represents, Kiva noted, tilting her chin towards Tilda. The king and queen come from the Valentus line, Mott mused. They're direct relations of Serana, or the queen is at least. They'd have to look into any rumours, wouldn't they? Specifically ones about the rebel queen who could take their throne out from under them. Kiva pinched the bridge of her nose. Can we please stop talking about this? I need to get back to work. I have a question, Tip said, bouncing in his seat. It's quick, I promise. Put your hand down, Tip, Kiva said wearily. He did so, but continued bouncing as he said, how does their magic work? Torvin's and Serana's, and the Valentus family, they all have elemental powers. Well, not the king, but the queen and their heirs. How do they... He made a flicking gesture with his fingers as if imitating sparks shooting from them. Summon them, magic. Kiva squinted at the boy. How am I supposed to know? It's not just the royals, Jaren jumped in, a small contemplative crinkle between his brow. All eyes turned to him, and his expression cleared swiftly. I mean, I've heard there are anomalies too, born outside the royal bloodline, just like in ancient days. They're rare, but still. Kiva snorted. We've all heard about those anomalies. They're nothing more than wishful stories for children, something they can dream about but never attain. No, love, Jaren's right, Mott said, scratching his bald patch. I saw one once. Kiva straightened. What? I was travelling around Miravan years ago. That's when I saw her, the mortician said. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6, waving her hands and making water leap from a fountain. Really? Tip said, wondering his eyes. Mott nodded. It sure was something. I've never seen anything like it, before or since. Tip turned to Kiva. Do you think I could have magic? Maybe I just don't know it yet. Kiva felt wholly unqualified to have this conversation. In the gentlest voice she could manage, she said, I'm sorry, Tip, but even if anomalies are real, Jaren's right when he says they're rare. We're talking 1 in every 100 years, if that. But Mott saw that one, Kiva said, still gently, though she wondered when Mott saw his magic-wielding child, and if perhaps he'd been on the spirit that day. She jumped down from the bench, ready to put this discussion to bed. It's getting late, and I have patients to check on, so story time's over. She looked at Tip and, ignoring the pang she felt seeing his disappointed face, said, Can you help Mott with Liku? The boy hesitated, as if wanting to ask more questions, but whatever he read in Kiva's expression had him nodding and sliding off the metal bench. Mott, too, looked like he wanted to continue talking, but wisely followed as Tip led the way to the quarantine room. Kiva walked over to her supplies and dug through them for another small jar of aloeweed to give Jaren, ready for him to leave. She didn't realize he'd followed until he spoke up right from behind her. Why are you helping her? Kiva spun around. Sorry? Jaren looked toward Tilda. If she really is the rebel queen, then she's responsible for everything they're doing, for all the unrest within Avalon. He turned back to Kiva. People are dying because of her and her followers. Lots of people. You're exaggerating, Kiva said dismissively. I'm not, Jaren said firmly. Things are changing out there, Kiva. What started as peaceful protest has become a bloodbath, and rebels moving from village to village, recruiting people and killing the guards who try to stop them. Not to mention the innocents who are hurt along the way. He held her eyes as he finished. And here you are, trying to save their leader's life. Don't let her die. That's my job, Kiva replied defensively, even as ice clutched at her heart. She hurt you. Jaren's eyes moved to her throat, and his voice low with concern. By the looks of it, I'm guessing she was trying to do more than that. What would have happened if Nari hadn't arrived when she did? Kiva recalled the darkness that had been spreading across her vision, the suffocating burn as she'd struggled to breathe, the panic of being unable to free herself. It doesn't matter, she said, turning back to continue searching for the aloeweed, now even more desperate for him to leave. How can you say that? He asked, exasperated. Kiva finally spotted the small jar and reached for it triumphantly. Only then did she face him again and say, Because it doesn't. She waved her free hand, indicating beyond the walls of the infirmary. This place is full of murderers and rapists and kidnappers, but I can't think of them that way. If they come to me with a problem, then I have to treat them. It's not my job to judge them, only to heal them. Kiva's gaze shifted to Tilda as she finished. Whether she's the rebel queen or not, whether she wants to overthrow the kingdom or not, whether she tries to kill me again or not, it doesn't matter. I have to help her anyway. Do you understand? Jaren studied Kiva's face for a long moment before he blew out a breath and nodded. I understand, but I don't like it. I never said I liked it, Kiva returned. How do you think it feels to help a man who chopped up his own children and claims he was selling pork offcuts to his local tavern when it was really human flesh? Jaren pulled a face. Please tell me you're making that up. Kiva jerked her thumb toward the quarantine room. He's in there right now, vomiting his guts up. And despite what he did, I have to do what it takes to help him survive. She held Jaren's gaze as she added, For all I know, you did something similar, and I helped you without question. She shoved the jar towards him. I'm still helping you. I can guarantee that I didn't butcher my own family, Jaren said with clear disgust, or anyone for that matter. That still leaves a lot of options, Kiva said, stepping away from him. Now excuse me, but I have to go and make sure the child butcherer is still alive. And you know why? Because that's your job. Now you're getting it, Kiva replied, before bidding him good night, sending a quick respectful nod to the solemn-looking Nari, and then slipping through the quarantine door as Tip and Mott stepped out, the limp weight of Liku carried between them. Another night in Zalandov, another dead prisoner. Hello, Ali. How you going? Thanks for joining. I'm going to read this next chapter and look at my cookies again for a minute and then probably get ready to wrap up. Chapter 9. Alicia and Nurgle were late, as always, but they finally arrived in the infirmary close to midnight, ready to relieve Kiva. Yawning, she instructed them to keep checking on the quarantined patients, and explained why Tilda was in shackles, asking them to come and get her if the woman regained consciousness. Stumbling back to her cell block, Kiva shivered against the crisp winter air and revelled in the peacefulness of the prison at night. Aside from the watchtower guards using their roaming aluminum beacons, her path was almost entirely dark, lit only by the overhead moonlight. Once the walk had petrified her, now she was used to it, finding comfort in the isolated stillness after a long day she'd endured. But even so, she picked up her pace, desperate for a quick shower so she could fall into bed and sleep her worries away. Arriving at cell block 7, Kiva slipped inside and hurried straight toward the bathing chambers at the far end. Her cellmates were snoring as she passed them, pallet after pallet of exhausted prisoners, many of them trembling under thin blankets. The shower block was empty, as it almost always was by the time Kiva arrived. She didn't tarry, stripping quickly and gritting her teeth in preparation for icy water. A gasp left her as the frigid sting of it touching her flesh, but no sooner had she stepped into the spray than she was yanked out again, her head snapping back from a vicious tug to her hair, a hand slapping over her mouth and dragging her out from under the water, her naked body slipping and sliding in the limestone floor. Kiva screamed, but the sound was muffled by the hand on her mouth, the one in her hair moving to snake around her stomach, squeezing tight enough the air was forced from her lungs. Shut it, healer, expletive. A cold voice hissed into her ear. Scream again and you'll regret it. Kiva stopped struggling, recognizing her voice. The moment she did, the arms released her and Kiva stumbled away from her captor, Cresta, the leader of the prison rebels. Not so fast, Cresta said, her tone threatening enough to halt Kiva in her tracks. You and I need to have a chat. Trembling all over, and not just from the cold water pebbling her skin, Kiva straightened onto her full height. Heedless of her nakedness, she placed her hands on her hips and demanded, What do you think you're doing? Cresta tossed her red hair over her shoulder, the matted twist no longer hiding the full outline of the serpent tattoo coiling down the left side of her face. I told you we need to talk. Kiva weighed up her options before realizing she had none. Cresta was a warrior, one of the rare exceptions who had arrived as a teenager and lived longer than anticipated, having survived Zalandov for 5 years so far. With arms as thick as Kiva's thighs, the rest of her body rippling with muscle, the young woman was built like a bull, and she acted like one too. Other prisoners might be too exhausted to cause much trouble, but Cresta revelled in it, actively going out of her way to whisper rumours and start fights. Almost all the riots that had transpired in the last 5 years had been incited by her, though she was smart enough to make sure someone else always took the blame, just as she was smart enough to keep from being outed as the leader of Zalandov's rebels. While it was assumed she held that position, there was no evidence, nothing the guards could act on. Warden Rook needed information. If Kiva played her cards right, maybe Cresta would slip up and give something away, something Kiva could use to continue proving her worth as an informant. Talk about what? Kiva asked, her trembles turning to full body shakes in the freezing air. For pity's sake, put your clothes on, Cresta said, sneering. I don't need to see. She waved her hand and pulled a face. All that. Kiva bit her tongue to keep from pointing out that Cresta could have wrestled her before she'd entered the shower, or even after she was done, but she didn't want to risk angering the woman. If it came to a physical fight, Cresta would win with ease. Kiva dressed quickly. Quickly dressing, Kiva felt only slightly more comfortable as she turned back to the warrior. She opened her mouth to demand an answer, but Cresta beat her to it. Word around the prison is that the rebel queen is here, and that she's sick. Kiva said nothing, unsurprised that Cresta knew. She had almost as many spies as the warden. I want to make you a trade, the young woman continued. Kiva kept her face blank, though she couldn't deny that she was curious. What did Cresta want, and what did you think it was worth to Kiva? You're going to save Tilda Quarantine's life, Cresta stated. You're going to make sure that she stays alive long enough to be rescued. And in return, I won't kill that boy you're so fond of, the one with the stutter. Tip, isn't it? Or the breath left Kiva. What? She whispered. You heard me, Cresta said, her hazel eyes flashing. Save the rebel queen, and you save the boy. If she dies, he dies. Before Kiva could begin to calm her panicking mind, the shower block's aluminum beacon fizzled and popped, enveloping her in darkness. It sparked to life again mere seconds later, but by the time it did, Cresta was gone. What I don't understand is why she thinks she needs to bargain with you, Warden Rook said, peering at Kiva from across his desk, his fingers steepled under his chin. After her run-in with Cresta, Kiva had headed straight to the southern wall and told the guards on duty that she needed to speak with the warden. Despite it being the middle of the night, Warden Rook was still awake and working in his office, his polished perfection at odds with her rumpled, damp and shaking self. You're already under orders to get Tilda Quarantine healthy enough for trial by ordeal. Why would Cresta think you need more motivation? Rook asked. His expression turned pensive as he continued. Unless she doesn't know about the trials, we haven't announced them yet, but I'd assume word has begun to spread regardless. A small, satisfied smile touched his lips. Perhaps the prison rebels aren't as informed as they would like to think. Whatever her reasons, it doesn't matter, Kiva said, sitting on the edge of her seat, a solid weight of anxiety balling in her stomach. She threatened Tip's life. You need to let him leave. Rook's dark brows arched upward towards his hairline. Excuse me? It took everything within Kiva to push aside her trepidation and say, He's only here because he was with his mother when she was caught. He was 8 years old at the time, just a boy. He's still just a boy. He doesn't deserve this life. Neither did Kiva, having arrived a year younger than Tip, but she'd long since given up trying to talk her own way free of Zalandov. The warden made an impatient sound. We've already discussed this multiple times. The answer remains the same. As long as he has no guardian to claim him, he's considered a ward of Zalandov. He can go free, but only if someone comes to collect him. But he's innocent, Kiva said, leaning forward, barely managing to remain in her seat. And now Cresta wants to use him against me. Many in here are innocent, Rook said dismissively. If you do your job, Cresta won't have a reason to harm him. For once, she and I are in agreement on something. Fancy that. Kiva wondered if she'd ever hated the warden more than in that moment. Gnawing on her lip, she lowered her voice and admitted, Tilda is really unwell, and I don't know what's wrong with her. I don't know if I can save her, and if I can't... Let me be frank, Rook said, sitting back and relaxing deeper into his plush chair. I personally don't care if the rebel queen lives or dies. These upcoming trials are a hassle, and the planning of them is giving me indigestion. So many rules to follow, so much organizing to be done to prepare the 4 tasks, with missives arriving daily from every kingdom, issuing advice and wanting to be kept informed. Thank goodness that only the Valentis heirs are coming in person, since they're going to cause me enough of a headache to last a lifetime. Rook pinched his lips together and continued, But as frustrating as this all is, I've been ordered to see that Tilda Quarantine's sentence is carried out. The tightness of his features made it clear how he felt about these orders, especially after having been free to reign with little accountability until now. For that to happen, she needs to stay alive, Rook went on. And for that to happen, you need to do your darn job. His face darkened as he added, If Tilda doesn't survive long enough to complete in the first trial, it won't just be Tip's life in danger. Do I make myself clear? Kiva's heart was thumping in her chest. She swallowed and nodded, unable to form a verbal response. Warden Rook's expression lightened. You did well coming to me tonight, Kiva. I'm glad you listened the last time we spoke. Keep up the good work and everything will be just fine. Again, Kiva nodded, still incapable of speech. His praise should have brought her some relief, confirmation that she'd given him enough information to remain useful for the time being, but what he didn't know was that what she'd withheld. Cresta hadn't just ordered Skievers to save Tilda's life. Cresta had also said the rebel queen needed to remain alive until her rescue. A rescue that Skievers didn't mention to Rook for fear of what it might mean for her own impending freedom. Even if she had no idea when it would occur, it was one thing to follow the warden's command to get Tilda to the first trial, but beyond that, how was she going to keep the rebel queen alive? Tip's life depended on her figuring that out. Skievers' life depending on her figuring that out. Because if she failed, whether by Cresta's hand or by the warden's, they were all dead. The end of chapter 9. So next time when we return, we'll be at chapter 8. I'm sorry that you're not feeling well, Ali. I hope you are feeling better soon. Just have a quick drink here. Hang on. I mean 10. You know what I mean. I am tired. He said leave me alone. So we got like heaps of things. So let's buy a time machine. Have a look at the stats for a minute. Galactic Bakery, bake 100 million cookies. And time machine. Have one time machine. Maths with Skievers. No, it's really not maths with Skievers. $18, eh? And we're on page 88, I think, of 403. Yep, we're on page 88. So we're 21% of the way through, according to Goodreads. So, make it real, twice as effective. Minor grandmas. That. Alright. Achievement unlocked enhancer. Let's see what that is. Purchase 20 upgrades. Nice. Well, I think that's probably all for now. It's going to take me ages to get to enough money to get those last two things to be even. So that's fine. So, yeah, I think we will leave it at that for this week. And next week we will continue starting at chapter 10. And we will see how far we get. But thank you for joining me all on this stream, on this new stream. It's been fun. Thank you, everybody in the chat. Novak, Sharky, and Ali. And thank you earlier for the 100 bits, Novak. We appreciate that a lot. Thank you. And we will see you guys for the next video. Bye-bye.